Could the CalRecycle and HF&H folks turn on their webcams? Perfect. Thank you guys so much. So let's get started. It is 1 o'clock. So hi all, and welcome to the Bay Area Regional Webinar. My name is Ashley Yee, and I am CalRecycle's SB 1383 Implementation Manager. And before I turn it over to Julia Doloff, who will go over logistics of the webinar, I just wanted to introduce all who will be presenting and are available to respond to questions. So once I say your name, if you just wave so we know who you are. So from CalRecycle, we have Kyle Pogue, Tim Hall, and Martine Boswell representing edible food. We have Scott Beckner, Michelle Dewey, and Kristen Pidcock representing procurement. We have Kara Morgan representing collections. We have Julia Doloff representing collections, and who also helped put together all of these regional webinars. So thank you so much, Julia, for working on all the logistics. We have Alan Ilazorio and Tricia Moore representing compliance and enforcement. And we also have Sarah Khalid and Sarah Sanders, who are going to be helping with the Q&A portion. So a big thank you to them for volunteering for helping us with that. Also with us today, we have Rob Hilton and Tracy Swanborn from HF&H. So as most of you guys know, HF&H Consulting helped develop the 4 CalRecycle SB 1383 model tools. And as a reminder, those tools are the model franchise, the model ordinance, the model procurement policy, and the model edible food recovery agreement. So Tracy and Rob can also respond to any questions, as they have a magnitude of experience with helping cities, counties, jurisdictions plan for everything 1383. They've been following the rulemaking process from day one. So please, if you have any questions for them, please ask those as well. So now I'll turn it over to Julia to go over logistics. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ashley. So I'm going to get the PowerPoint slide back up and then get us started. So one moment, please. Let me get some functions out of my way. Okay. All right. Thank you for your patience. So good morning, everyone. Today, each team will be providing an overview presentation of the regulatory requirements for each specified topic. Afterwards, there will be a Q&A session in which CalRecycle staff will unmute participants to allow you to ask your questions over the webinar. So please use the instructions shown on this slide for the Q&A session. If you're watching via the CalEPA broadcast link, you may email your questions to the SLCP inbox. If you are using the GoToWebinar platform, please type your question into the question pane. Staff will unmute participants in the order that questions come in. Note that you will need to unmute yourself on your end when asked to by CalRecycle staff, and please state your affiliation before asking your question. CalRecycle staff may respond to some questions in writing through the GoToWebinar question pane function, so please review the question pane for those responses. For those of you who are watching via the broadcast, we will also verbalize some of these questions and responses for you to hear as well. Questions and comments regarding the merit of the regulations were responded to during the rulemaking period. So today we will be focusing on questions or clarifications regarding implementation and tools. If we do not get to your question today, we will try to follow up with you at a later date. Now I will hand it off to Kyle Pogue and Martine Boswell, who will cover the Edible Food Recovery Program requirements.
Hi, everybody.
Kyle,
Julia,
really quickly, Kyle, sorry to interrupt. The presentation looks cut off, and it looks like it's cut off on others as well. So Julia, can you stop sharing your screen really quickly and then try to share it again to see if we can see the screen?
Yeah, one moment. Let's see here. Is that any better?
Yep, it's better. I'm hoping
Okay.
it's better for everyone else. It is better. So, okay, Kyle, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. It's looking good on this end. So thank you, Julia. Appreciate the introduction. I just want to start by saying, this is such an exciting time, the rollout of the edible food portion of these regulations, and we're excited to share information with you today about this really pretty groundbreaking program. And on that note, I just really want to thank many of you who are on this call, and there are many others statewide too that have contributed to this regulatory package, really, and what we're going to be sharing today. And it was with stakeholder input, and I've got a few of them jotted down. These are just so you know that local governments and food recovery organizations and services and industry associations and specific generators, edible food generators, and public health departments and waste and recycling industry professionals and our colleagues and other state agencies have all contributed to what we're going to present today. So I want to thank you for that profound effort, and just acknowledge that we're looking forward to rolling into implementation with this program. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Martine Boswell, who does a fantastic job running us through what the requirements are within these regulations, and then we're available for some Q&A. So thanks for your time today. Appreciate it. Martine?
Thanks, Kyle, and I apologize to all of our attendees. I've had major connectivity issues today in particular, so in the interest of trying to make sure that I don't get dropped off the internet or that my computer doesn't freeze, I'm not going to be using my webcam for this webinar, so I apologize for that in advance. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this training. I just want to echo what Kyle said. We really are grateful for all of you that participated in the rulemaking process and all of the feedback and very helpful comments that you provided. There were many times where we made revisions to the regulations due to the feedback that we received, or times where we were able to incorporate ideas that were completely that of the stakeholders. Again, just really want to say thank you for that. In this first presentation, we're going to be covering SB 1383's 20% edible food recovery goal and the regulations and policies that have been developed to help California achieve this ambitious statewide target. As part of California's larger strategy to combat climate change, SB 1383 included a 20% edible food recovery goal. So what does that mean? Well, it's written in the law of SB 1383, so in the statutory language, that no less than 20% of currently disposed edible food must be recovered for human consumption by 2025. I do want to clarify a couple of things about this goal because we get a lot of questions about this. This is a statewide goal. This is not a goal for individual jurisdictions to achieve a 20% edible food recovery rate. This is also not a goal for individual food facilities or generators to arrange to have 20% of their surplus edible food be recovered for human consumption. Rather, this is a statewide goal that California must collectively achieve. The law, so SB 1383's statutory language, also clarified or specified, if you will, that the department, meaning CalRecycle, must adopt regulations intended to help achieve this 20% edible food recovery goal. And it is the policies that are included in the regulations that I will be discussing in this presentation. Now, one other thing that I want to bring your attention to as it relates to the goal itself. When you look at the organic waste disposal reduction targets, which are the 50% and the 75% target, which you see in the dark gray and the black, you'll see that it says from the 2014 level. So in statute, it's specified a baseline year that progress would be measured against for the organic waste disposal reduction targets. For the edible food recovery goal, the statute did not specify a baseline year. As a result, CalRecycle will most likely be using data from our 2018 statewide disposal facility-based waste characterization study, which measured the amount of potentially donatable food that is disposed, we will most likely be using that data either specifically to measure the edible food baseline or to help inform how we measure the edible food baseline. So most likely, we will be using a 2018 baseline year for the edible food recovery baseline. And finally, I just think that it's very important to mention that California will be the first government in the world to ever implement an edible food recovery regulatory package of this scope and magnitude. The only other country that's ever implemented anything like this was France, and it didn't go as far as what 1383 is about to do. This could not come at a more important time in California's history, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, where hunger has doubled in most counties, and in some counties it has tripled. So what we really want to make sure is that if food is going to go to waste, and that's food that could be recovered, that we are intervening and making sure that that food goes to its highest and best use of helping feed people in need. So thank you for allowing me to provide that very important context. Next slide. So the key policies that I'm going to cover that are included in the edible food recovery regulations are included on this slide. Something that I didn't include, but I will be discussing first and foremost is how edible food is defined. Depending on which organization you're speaking to or what report you're reading, you might see edible food have a very different definition of how it's defined in 1383. But it's very important, since you hear the term often and many times throughout this presentation, to remember that it has a very specific definition in the context of the SB 1383 regulation. So I'll talk about that on the next slide. One of the first major policy components that I'm going to discuss are that there will be direct requirements placed on commercial edible food generators. These are the entities that will be required to arrange to have the maximum amount of their edible food that would otherwise be disposed be recovered for human consumption. Now, as I go through each of these bullets, I'll be providing just a very high level of the policy itself, and then on the subsequent slides, I will talk about these policies in much more detail. So the second key policy is that counties, in coordination with jurisdictions within the county and regional agencies within the county, will need to perform capacity planning analyses specifically to determine if they have sufficient edible food recovery capacity to meet their edible food recovery needs. So really, do they have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that's needing to be recovered from the generators that have these requirements placed on them? The third policy component is that jurisdictions will be required to implement edible food recovery programs. And finally, I'll conclude by discussing some of the requirements that will be placed on food recovery organizations and services that voluntarily choose to participate in SB 1383. And I'll talk more about what I mean by voluntarily choose to participate when we get to that portion of the presentation. Next slide. So what does edible food mean? Edible food in the context of the SB 1383 regulations, so this is how it's defined in the regulations, means in food intended for human consumption. So it's very broad, that definition. However, the definition in the regulations also specifies that nothing in the regulations requires or authorizes the recovery of edible food that does not meet the food safety requirements of the California Retail Food Code. So this is very important. This is absolutely critical. This is the food safety piece of all of this. Just because the food is intended for human consumption, that does not necessarily mean that it can safely be recovered. So not only for it to be edible, not only does it need to be intended for human consumption, but it must meet all of the food safety requirements of the California Retail Food Code for it to be considered edible and eligible for donation. Now, we also specify in the definition of edible food that edible food is not solid waste if it is recovered and not discarded. This is very important. This is food. It's not waste. It's before the bin. So if it is safe to have it be recovered, it meets that edible food definition, then again, we really need to make sure that it is going to its highest and best use of helping feed people in need. Now, to provide a little bit of information about the photos on this slide, this is really just for example's sake. The photo on the left was taken from one of CalRecycle's food waste prevention and rescue grantees. These were some of their recoveries that they were making from K through 12 schools. So again, for example's sake, we'll say that none of those eggs are cracked. they've been kept at the proper cooling temperature. All the food is in its original unopened package and in its whole state. So this is food that, again, for example purposes, would be safe to have it be recovered and meet all Cal Code food safety requirements. Compare that, however, to the photo on the right. This is food that's been out on an unsupervised open buffet line where the customer is able to serve themselves. Most local health departments in California would not allow for this food to be donated for human consumption. I have heard of some situations where a county health department was considering that, but the majority would not allow for that to be donated. So it is intended for human consumption, but it does not meet all of the food safety requirements of the California Retail Food Code. So that would not be food that would need to be recovered under SB 1383. Next slide. So the first key policy component that I really want to focus on today are the commercial edible food generators. These are the entities that will have direct requirements placed on them, where they will be required to arrange to have the maximum amount of their edible food be recovered for human consumption. We've separated the generators into two tiers, and this was largely due to feedback that we received from key stakeholders saying that the tier 2 generators will need additional time to comply. So why would that be? So the tier 1 generators, many of them already have food donation programs in place. They're already doing it. This is not going to be as heavy a lift for them. They also tend to have larger volumes of food available on a routine basis that's available for food recovery. And they're dealing with types of food, not always, but more often, that are where we have the networks in place to be able to recover that type of food. So it's a lot of produce, fresh and frozen grocery, and non-perishable items. Not always, but usually. Compare that, however, to the tier 2 generators. So their tier 2 generators are required to comply 2 years after the tier 1 generators, beginning January 1st, 2024. Many of these generators, they know about food recovery, but they're not doing it already. They don't have any food donation practices in place. They also oftentimes are dealing with types of food like prepared foods, cold and hot prepared foods, where the networks sometimes are not in place to be able to recover that type of food. So we need to make sure that those generators, food recovery organizations and services and jurisdictions are given an additional 2 years to prepare for this, to prepare for compliance, to build capacity where it's needed, things like that. So again, these are the commercial edible food generators. I just wanted to give you a high-level overview of these entities. And now I'll talk about what their key requirements are in more detail. Next slide. So as I mentioned, commercial edible food generators, those are the tier 1 and the tier 2 generators that I was just showing you. Their requirement, their key requirement, is that they must arrange to recover the maximum amount of their edible food that would otherwise be disposed, and they must accomplish this either through a contract or a written agreement with a food recovery organization or service that will come and collect the food directly from the generator, or with a food recovery organization that will accept the food that the generator self-hauls. So I want to bring your attention to that self-haul option. We added that specifically due to feedback we received from the California Association of Food Banks. Their recommendation to us was that, you know, it's costly to recover food, and the onus should not be only on the food recovery organization. And so it's an option, it's not a requirement. If it works for the food recovery organization and for the generator, then absolutely that is an option for them where the generator could self-haul that edible food. One other thing I'd like to bring your attention to is that all of this needs to be done through a contract or written agreement. CalRecycle and the regulations themselves for 1383 is silent on what needs to go in that contract or written agreement. It's really at the discretion of the generator and the food recovery organization or service that they're working with to determine what provisions need to be included in the contract or written agreement. So I'll talk about that now on the next slide. Julia, if you could advance it one. While the regulations are silent on what needs to be included in the contract or written agreement, CalRecycle, in consultation with our contractor, HF&H, who's joining us in the webinar today, developed a model food recovery agreement. This is a tool that does not have to be used, but it absolutely can be used to help generators comply with their requirement to establish a contract or written agreement, and also to help food recovery organizations and services to make sure that their unique needs are met as it relates to food recovery. So in the model food recovery agreement, going back to that self-haul option, for example, if a food recovery organization or service did want to allow a generator to self-haul their edible food, then the contract or written agreement could potentially specify, and like it does in the model food recovery agreement, it could have, well, in the model food recovery agreement, it has options where you can choose what your delivery days and drop-off windows would be for self-haul, for example. So that's really important. But the model food recovery agreement goes so much farther than that. It identifies different cost-sharing models so that maybe not all of the cost for recovering the food falls on the food recovery organization. It supports jurisdictions with developing the food recovery programs. It also really will help those using the tool to increase their understanding of the regulations and compliance strategies. But it also includes a lot of really important things to protect food recovery organizations from donation dumping, to ensure that food is recovered in a safe and reliable manner, things like that. It really incorporates a level of professionalism, reliability, and food safety into food recovery. And not saying that that's not already there, but we wanted to create a tool that would further support that. And so the model food recovery agreement is housed on CalRecycle's 1383 education and outreach webpage. If you scroll down to the bottom of the webpage, all of the model tools are listed there, and the model food recovery agreement is one of those tools. Next slide. So the next section that I'm going to discuss is edible food recovery capacity. This involves all the capacity planning requirements for edible food recovery. And so this is another one of those key policies that I think is very important to cover. Next slide. So for capacity planning, and again, this is so important because if all of these generators are going to be having food available to donate or to have be recovered because they have direct requirements placed on them, then we need to ensure that we have sufficient capacity to be able to recover that food. Otherwise, if we don't have sufficient capacity, that food is just going to still end up going to waste, or a large portion of it will. So that would be really tragic, and we want to make sure that we have the capacity in place. If we don't have the capacity, that we do the proper planning to ensure that we can increase capacity if it's needed. So there are some key requirements within the capacity planning section. The first key requirement is that counties, in coordination with cities, special districts that provide solid waste collection services, and regional agencies located within the county, will be required to estimate the amount of edible food that will be disposed by the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators located within the county and jurisdictions within the county. Now, this may seem like a daunting task. However, CalRecycle has been developing a capacity planning calculator tool that will specifically help jurisdictions come up with these estimates. The calculator even takes it a step further if a jurisdiction wants to have this information, but in addition to providing you with an estimate of the overall amount of edible food that's disposed by Tier 1 and Tier 2 generators, the calculator could even break it down further and tell you the type of food available based on CalRecycle's waste characterization data. So that's very high level on the calculator tool. That will be coming soon. It's not final yet, but again, we are developing tools and resources to assist counties, jurisdictions with fulfilling the capacity planning requirements. Next slide. So once a jurisdiction knows this is the amount of edible food that needs to be recovered, essentially, this is the amount of edible food that's going to be disposed by these generators, they then need to identify their existing capacity at food recovery organizations and services to see, do we have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that's estimated to be disposed. So in addition to identifying the food recovery capacity that's available, they'll also need to identify proposed new or expanded capacity, and also identify, if any, the amount of new or expanded capacity that will be needed to meet their edible food recovery needs. So this is, again, very, very important. If it's determined that they do not have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that's estimated to be disposed by those tier 1 and tier 2 generators, then they will need to submit an implementation schedule documenting what their plans are to increase capacity. Next slide. Yeah, so in order to comply with those requirements that I was just talking about assessing capacity, their current food recovery capacity, jurisdictions will have to consult with food recovery organizations and food recovery services. And any entity that is approached by the jurisdiction for information about their capacity, per the regulations, must respond to the request within 60 days. Now, in addition to developing that capacity planning calculator tool, CalRecycle has also developed a food, capacity planning survey. And this is a survey that can be used, absolutely does not have to be used, but essentially what it does is it asks very critical questions, and the county or the jurisdiction can then distribute the survey to their local food recovery organizations and services to gain information and insight into what their current capacity is, and answer some key questions to help a jurisdiction determine, do we have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that's estimated to be disposed. So we have that calculator tool and a survey that jurisdictions can use, really that is focused entirely on helping them comply with the edible food recovery capacity planning requirements. Next slide. So as I mentioned, if a county determines that additional edible food recovery capacity is needed to meet their needs, the county must notify any jurisdiction that lacks capacity and let them know that they are required, each jurisdiction that lacks capacity is required to submit an implementation schedule to CalRecycle. And again, they will need to consult with food recovery organizations and food recovery services to really determine what do they need most to increase capacity, things like that. And that survey that I just mentioned will also help answer some of those questions. The survey, just like the calculator tool, it is not final yet. It still needs to go through a few levels of review from our legal team, but we do hope to have those posted on our website sometime soon. Next slide. The next key policy component is the Jurisdiction Edible Food Recovery Program. As part of these programs, jurisdictions will be required to educate commercial edible food generators about the commercial edible food generator requirements that they are subject to. This is really important, so generators know that they actually have to comply with something. They need to be educated about that. Jurisdictions will also need to increase commercial edible food generators' access to food recovery organizations and services. This is going to be very important in more rural areas, making sure that there is access to these organizations. Now, the enforcement piece. Jurisdictions will also be required to monitor commercial edible food generators' compliance. It's absolutely critical. And going back to capacity planning, jurisdictions will need to increase edible food recovery capacity if it is determined that sufficient capacity does not exist. We also included language in the Jurisdiction Edible Food Recovery Program section of the regulations. It's not a requirement, but rather it's language to help encourage jurisdictions or get them to start thinking really creatively about how they could potentially fund their program. This language states that a jurisdiction may, and we emphasize the word may because it's not shall, it's may. A jurisdiction may fund their food recovery program through franchise fees, local assessments, or other funding mechanisms. So in addition to the Model Food Recovery Agreement, which is one of the tools that was developed by CalRecycle and HF&H, a Model Franchise Agreement was also developed. And in that Model Franchise Agreement, it includes specific provisions to include food recovery into your franchise agreement. So that was very exciting to see. And that's just one example of how you could think through developing a sustainable funding source or a potentially sustainable funding source to help cover the costs of implementing your food recovery program. Next slide. A little bit more about the jurisdiction requirements specifically around education and outreach. As I mentioned, jurisdictions will need to educate commercial edible food generators about their requirements that they're subject to, and by that I mean the generator requirements. But jurisdictions also will have specific education and outreach requirements that they'll need to comply with that relate directly to edible food recovery. So one of those requirements is that they will need to develop a list of food recovery organizations and services that are operating within the jurisdiction. They will need to update that list annually and maintain the list on their website. As part of that list, they'll need to include the name, address, contact information, collection service area, and the types of food accepted for each food recovery organization and service that they list. That survey, that capacity planning survey that I mentioned, if that survey is distributed to local food recovery organizations and services, the information that's collected in that survey will help jurisdictions create these lists because it answers each of those questions, like name, address, collection service area, types of food accepted. All of that is included in the survey. Something I do want to clarify about this list, because we get this question a lot. A jurisdiction does not need to list all food recovery organizations and services that are operating in the jurisdiction. They just need to develop a list. So it's very important that jurisdictions understand that it is at the discretion of the jurisdiction to determine which food recovery organizations and services are best suited to include on that list or most appropriate. So just wanted to clarify that. Next slide. Regarding enforcement, as I mentioned, as part of the program, jurisdictions will be required to monitor commercial edible food generator compliance. So jurisdictions must have an enforcement and inspection program that includes inspections to verify that commercial edible food generators do have a contract or written agreement with the food recovery organization or service, and that the commercial edible food generator is maintaining records. So I didn't have a chance to cover that in this presentation, but commercial edible food generators are also required to maintain records of certain information. So if you do have questions about that, we'd be happy to answer those at the end of this presentation. And if we don't get to the question, we can answer it in writing. The inspection and enforcement of Tier 1 generators will begin in 2022. And for Tier 2 generators, it will begin in 2024. We did receive some comments saying that these inspections could be duplicative because the health inspector is already inspecting many of these as food facilities. So we do want to emphasize that the regulations include language that specifies that there's nothing that prohibits a jurisdiction from contracting with their local health department to fulfill some or all of the edible food recovery requirements. So for example, a jurisdiction could contract with their local health department to do the inspections of some or all edible food generators. That is absolutely allowed. However, ultimately the compliance itself falls on the jurisdiction. So if a jurisdiction's contracting with their health department and the health department is not doing the inspections, CalRecycle would have a conversation with the jurisdiction to figure out what's going on. But that's getting really into the details on things. So we can take that conversation offline if anyone has further questions about that. Next slide. Finally, the last component that I'm going to discuss is for food recovery organizations and services. And Julia, if you could advance one more. Thank you. So for food recovery organizations and services, not all of them are going to be required to comply with these requirements. It's up to a food recovery organization or service to determine if they want to participate in SB 1383. For example, what I mean by that is if a grocer, let's say that they're a commercial edible food generator, they're a supermarket, they approach a food bank and say, we would like to have a contract or written agreement with you pursuant to SB 1383. The food bank does not have to enter into that contract or written agreement. They can decide yes or no. However, if they do decide to enter into a contract or written agreement with a commercial edible food generator pursuant to SB 1383, then they will be required to maintain records and report certain information. So again, this is only for food recovery organizations and services that voluntarily choose to enter into a contract or written agreement with a commercial edible food generator pursuant to SB 1383. They will be required to maintain a record of the name, address, and contact information for each Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generator that they contract with pursuant to SB 1383, and the quantity in pounds of food collected from each Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generator per month. So those are the record-keeping requirements. They will also be required to report one piece of information. They will be required to report the total pounds of edible food recovered in the previous calendar year to one jurisdiction, and that is the jurisdiction where their primary address is physically located. So I get a lot of questions about this, so I'll clarify again, just in case anything is unclear. First, there is no requirement to report donor names. They are only required to report the total pounds of edible food recovered from the Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators that they contract with to one jurisdiction. So we really wanted to make sure that no double counting is going on. Again, so if you are a food bank, and let's say you're located in one jurisdiction, and that's where your primary address is located, you might be rescuing food from hundreds of generators across many jurisdictions, but you're only required to report the total pounds collected from the Tier 1 and Tier 2 generators that you have a contract with pursuant to SB 1383 to the one jurisdiction where your primary address is physically located, and you do not have any requirement to report donor names, just the total pounds collected. And they will have that information because SB 1383 requires them to maintain a record of it. Now, we also worked really closely with our food recovery organization and service stakeholders to ensure that what we were requiring them to maintain a record of was information that they already track, and that we were not requiring them to report any proprietary food donor information. So we were very mindful of that. And so if you do have questions about that, happy to answer them. Next slide. So to conclude, I just want to go over some key edible food recovery dates. As of 2022, jurisdictions will be required to establish their edible food recovery programs. The Tier 1 generators must become compliant. Jurisdictions will begin capacity planning for edible food recovery. Jurisdictions will also begin their education and outreach, which will be conducted annually. And the jurisdictions will begin their inspections of the Tier 1 generators and the food recovery organizations and services that are participating in SB 1383 to ensure that they are maintaining records and that they report. As of 2024, the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators will need to become compliant. Jurisdictions will begin their inspections of the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators, and jurisdictions will be able to take enforcement action for non-compliant entities. Next slide. So that concludes the edible food recovery presentation. Thank you so much for your time and for listening. We'd be happy to take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Kyle and Martine, for your great presentation. So this is Julia again. So just a reminder to please review this slide for how the Q&A session is going to go. We are going to start off with 2 questions that came in to the SLCP inbox. These are from Rachel Balsley with Stop Waste. And Rachel, right after I read the question out that you sent in, I will unmute you so you can add anything if you'd like. So Rachel's first question is, since it appears some or all wholesale food vendors and food distributors might be permitted by California Department of Public Health, not local environmental health departments, can CalRecycle play a role in coordinating with that state department to incorporate 1383 compliance into their inspections or permitting process? And Rachel, you're unmuted if you want to add anything. Martine and Kyle, I will toss that over to you.
Yeah,
Rachel.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
go
we
ahead.
can hear you.
Okay, great. This is Rachel from Stop Waste, Alameda County Waste Management Authority. And yeah, we already had our local health department reach out to the California Department of Public Health to see if there can be any coordination there. And the California Department of Public Health contact said, no, that's not our jurisdiction. But it seems so inefficient for all of our individual jurisdictions throughout the state to be duplicating efforts where the California Public Health Department is already permitting those sites.
Kyle, do
Thank you.
you want to?
Yeah, I can go. Thank you for the question, Rachel. We are reaching out to the California Department of Public Health to have this discussion, but we have not had it yet. So I think it's a good question that you're asking, and we're gonna touch base with them to see if they have any additional thoughts on that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel, I just wanted to add, I just wanted to say thank you for bringing that to our attention, because we've reached out to CDPH before during rulemaking just to get feedback on the regulations themselves, but these are the types of comments that are really helpful in terms of implementation. So we definitely have started that process, and Kara Morgan's team has been fantastic getting contacts with CDPH. So just know that we are getting that process started. We do intend on speaking with CDPH and seeing what can be done.
Thank you.
And then I'm going to read off another question that Rachel sent in, and I just want to let you know also that we'll get to your other edible food questions offline, just because there's quite a few. So the other question we are going to address today is the state agency cafeteria square footage defined as the square footage of the cafeteria alone, or the square footage of the entire building footprint where the cafeteria is located? So again, handing that off to Kyle and Martine, and Rachel, feel free to add anything.
Nothing to add.
Martine, you want to take that one?
Sure. So, this is just my initial thinking. So I do not have this vetted by our attorneys yet. But my initial thinking on that would be, it would be based on the size of the cafeteria and not the total facilities footprint. And again, I would want to have our attorneys verify that, but that would be my initial guidance.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Natasha Wasim. Natasha, you're self-muted if you wanted to unmute and ask your question. Okay, her question was, what was the 2014 level?
So the 2014 level is a 2014 baseline year for the organic waste disposal reduction targets. So that when measuring progress to see if we have achieved the organic waste disposal reduction targets, we'd be measuring that based on that baseline year. And so in the presentation, what I was trying to clarify was that for edible food recovery, no baseline year was specified in statute. So there is no 2014 baseline year for edible food. Most likely the baseline year will be 2018. Those decisions about the edible food baseline are still being made at the executive level. So I can't say with 100% certainty that the baseline year for edible food will be 2018, but that it looks to be headed in that direction right now. So for information on what the 2014 baseline is for the organic waste disposal reduction targets, that would require a separate request. I do not have that information, but maybe Kara Morgan may have that number. I would recommend us, if you send us an email, we can reach out to you, or maybe Ashley can answer that question.
So I do have that number. So the 2014 baseline for the organics, we disposed of 23 million tons in the landfill. So as you know, there is two other targets within 13A3. So there is the 50% reduction in 2020, and then the 75% reduction in 2025. So right now we do not have the finalized 2020 numbers yet, but it's looking like we're not going to meet that target because we were only allowed, if you take 50% of 23 million, we're only allowed to dispose of 11.5 million tons in landfill. In prior years, we were still in the 20s. So it doesn't look like we're going to meet that 2020 number. So we all have to pitch in together to try to meet the 2025 number. So I hope that helps clarify. If you have any other questions on that, please let us know.
And Ashley, I would just add, the reason the 2018 year is being considered is that's the first year we really looked closely through waste characterization studies at how much food is potentially edible. So pretty groundbreaking there, but that's the first data we have on that, which we did not have in 2014 or after that till 2018. Thanks.
Our next question is from Wanda. Wanda, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your affiliation. Okay, so Wanda's question was, will CalRecycle have a tool on its website to show the diversion progress?
Hi, Wanda. Kyle here. I responded to this one in the question feature, so I feel like I need a little bit more detail on what that question is asking, and happy to talk to you more about it offline as well, but I was a little unclear what the question was asking.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't able to get unmuted there for a second.
There you go, Wanda. Okay.
Wanda Reddick from City of Oakland Recycling Program. So my question was, we're talking about these statewide goals, but we have nowhere to see in real time where we are from month to month. What I was hoping for is some sort of chart or something that lives on your website that updates and lets us see where we are, so that we don't have to wait until annual reports come out. And it's just a visual tool that would help us be motivated, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Wanda. That helps. It's now I understand a little bit more. We will be receiving reporting from local governments on how much food recovery organizations are ultimately able to recover. So from that, we'll be having data over time. So that's something we can consider and discuss. How do we display that in a way that shows some progress? So I think it's a good point. Martine, feel free to add to that. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would just add that I'm grateful that you made that comment, Wanda, because for all the other CalRecycle folks on this call, what we can do is we can talk to our waste characterization team, others in our knowledge and integration section about if something like that would be possible to have it be on a basis that isn't annual, maybe something more frequent, just to see if that's even possible, and the resources that would be required to do something like that, and where we would get the data, things like that. But without the question being asked, we wouldn't know what to do. So I just really appreciate you asking that question and giving us more information about it. So yeah, that's the next step for me is I will talk to our waste characterization team and see what can be done.
And then really quickly before we go on to more questions, Kyle and Martine, just so you know, we are going to read the questions out loud that we did already answer in the chat, just in case people are just broadcasting it and not on the GoToWebinar. So the broadcast folks cannot see what the questions are in the chat.
Makes sense, Ashley. Thanks.
Take it away, Sarah, one of the Sarahs.
Okay, our next question is from Colleen Foster. Colleen, you're self-muted. If you wanted to unmute and ask your question, please. Okay, Colleen's question is, Tier 1 are generally donating, but it is regularly questionable whether they are donating the maximum amount. What does the maximum amount threshold look like? Who is to say what is maximum and what is not? How will CalRecycle expect jurisdictions to document a finding of maximum extent feasible?
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and I agree with what Colleen's saying about, you know, a lot of, for example, grocers. They're doing great work donating, but they may not be donating the maximum amount possible, and that's anecdotal data that we're getting from some of our food recovery stakeholders. So, for example, you may see a grocery store and they're donating a lot of their non-perishable goods, some produce, and some baked goods. And they routinely have a lot of baked goods available for donation, but there's a lot of really important high protein items that could be donated, and they're not donating them. So it's really about, you know, the food recovery organization working closely with that generator, explaining to them what foods can be donated, what they're willing to take. When it comes to assessing maximum amount, to Colleen's point, that could be something where it might be difficult to say, is this really the maximum amount? Again, this is just my initial thinking as someone who helped inform these policies. This would need to be vetted by CalRecycle's legal team, but my initial guidance would be that what the inspection official would be looking for when they're inspecting generators or reviewing the generator's records is really something more of a red flag. For example, if you're a supermarket, you're a tier 1 generator. You're required to maintain records of the total pounds recovered in the calendar, or in the recovered per month from your site. You also need to maintain a record of the established frequency that the food is collected and the types of food that you've donated. So if, for example, the inspector goes there and sees or reviews the record and sees that you're a supermarket and you've donated 10 pounds in the last 10 months and you have the food recovery organization coming on an on-call basis, that's a red flag that most likely they're not donating the maximum amount. You're really looking for things like that. In addition, the food recovery organization may reach out to the jurisdiction and say, hey, we've been really trying to work with this supermarket and let them know that that we're able to take this food and we continuously see them throwing the food away. These are things that you'd be looking for. So that's, again, my initial guidance, and I hope that that offers some help.
Can I respond if possible? This is Colleen Foster.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That actually helps a lot. I think one of the concerns too that I foresee happening, or I see it happening, I've already been working with some of our generators, is that in that scenario where the grocery store is not, say, donating, for example, their fresh products, so they're just donating the dry goods, etc., but they're not donating, you know, all of those other products. And they come back and say, well, we can't. The organizations that are picking up are only picking up on certain days. We can't hold all of these products in time for that, so we're extremely limited. So all of a sudden, that tier 1 generator has identified a capacity deficiency. And then when you get into the regulation, it's the jurisdiction's responsibility to ensure capacity. So am I putting, as a jurisdiction, am I getting myself into a situation, the more I investigate these and when I find gaps in food recovery, am I putting the jurisdiction into a situation where the jurisdiction is in violation? Because it's going to take a little while to develop these systems.
Absolutely. So my response to that one would be that since that is so situational, that we would need to confer with our legal team. And I do think it would be, this is a very important question. And I do think it's important that, and you bring up great points in every one of these workshops. So I would really like it if we could have a call offline with our legal team to discuss options for moving forward. And we've been doing this with generators as well, really when there's a very situational potential issue or question, that we set up a call offline to discuss it in more detail.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Martine. I've seen a number of questions in the question feature about that have headed that direction too, and you guys are seeing some of my responses about it, maybe more specific discussion to make sure we're understanding the question well. But so open arms to those types of conversations as well. I do want to recognize, Colleen, that, you know, for some, say a grocery store perhaps, they may need to work with several different food recovery organizations to be able to meet that need, because many are not equipped to handle all the types of foods that, as you know, right, that are generated there. So there could be, they may need to tap into capacity outside of one organization specifically and work with several. Thanks.
Our next question is from Joey. Joey, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your affiliation.
Yeah, my name is Joey Henowitz. I work for the city of Santa Rosa. And some of the questions that I have on the edible food recovery component is, are both the edible food generator and the edible food recovery organization required to maintain the record keeping, like the pounds that they use per month or the pounds per year? And then what is your recommendation as far as how they actually operationalize, you know, finding out what those pounds are? Are you expecting all of these organizations to have, you know, being able to weigh this stuff out, or what's your recommendation as far as identifying the pounds that they use either per month or per year?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start with the record keeping, and then I'll talk about the pounds and what we foresee in terms of how that would be measured. So for record keeping, both the generators and food recovery organizations and services are required to maintain records, although the record keeping requirements vary a little bit depending on whether you're a generator or a food recovery organization or service. They both are required to maintain a record of the total pounds that have been recovered. So the generator would need to maintain a record of the total pounds recovered from their site, and the food recovery organization and service would maintain a record of the total pounds that they've recovered from that generator. When it comes to actually measuring pounds, again, it's at the discretion of the food recovery organization or service to determine if they have the resources to participate in SB 1383, to enter into a contract or written agreement, knowing that they would be subject to record keeping and reporting requirements. So if they do willingly enter into that agreement, then they would need to have some mechanism in place to be able to measure the weight of the food that they're recovering. Most food recovery organizations and services are able to weigh the food. It's very important for them to, you know, measure or to quantify the impact that they are having, and measuring pounds is another way of then converting that into meals. So that's very important for them. So very rarely do I hear of a food rescue organization that doesn't have a mechanism for weighing the food. It's possible, but if they're participating in SB 1383, they do have to have some way of doing that. For the generator, knowing the pounds recovered, that's information they can get from the food recovery organization or service that they're working with. And that model food recovery agreement that I showed in the presentation, that includes specifications where it could say that the food recovery organization or service is going to provide us with information about the pounds that have been recovered from our site, things like that. So I hope that that answered the question.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Ruben. Ruben, if you want to unmute and state your affiliation and ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi, this is Ruben with Marine Sanitary Service. Just wanted to get clarification on the outreach and education requirements. Would this be, can this be delegated to hauler via city or town, or is this solely the responsibility of the jurisdiction? Thank you.
Yes, that's a very important question. I have an answer, but I feel like Kara Morgan will be able to answer this much better. If Kara is available, Hi, thank you.
Hey, thanks, Martine. Yeah, I also put this in the chat. So jurisdictions would be allowed to delegate this responsibility to the hauler, but as it's, and that's identified in the regulations, but also in the regulations, it makes it clear that the ultimate responsibility for compliance with the regulatory requirements is on the jurisdiction. So just because they delegate doesn't mean that they're off the hook for ensuring that they're like the hauler, for example, is not doing what it needs to do, because it is the jurisdiction that will receive the compliance evaluation and have to be responsible. Ruben, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Kara. Thank you very much.
And just to add to that, we're seeing a lot of jurisdictions collaborating with their haulers to help with this education outreach to both Tier 1 and Tier 2 generators. So it's a great opportunity.
All right, thank you, Kyle and Martine, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for your great questions. I see we have a lot more questions about edible food in the chat, so we will try to get to those if we do have time at the end of the Q&A sessions in the next 2 sessions. If we don't have time, we'll have to get back to you at a later date. So thank you so much for all of your questions. And with that, we are going to pass it along to Michelle Dewey for our presentation on the procurement requirements.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you all for having us here today. Today, I will be giving you a brief overview of the procurement requirements that are outlined in the SB 1383 regulations. We did want to leave the bulk of today's session open for Q&A, so this slideshow is a bit condensed. But if you need further information on the procurement requirements, please feel free to check out our webpage and, of course, contact us with any questions and ask your questions during today's Q&A. The procurement requirements are designed to help build the markets for products coming out of organics recycling facilities. And these are to also help close the loop on recovering and actually using the organic waste that will be diverted as a result of SB 1383. Today, I'll be discussing 2 distinct procurement requirements for jurisdictions, and that is to procure recovered organic waste products and recycled content paper. Next slide, please. So first, we'll talk about recovered organic waste products. These are shown here and include mulch, compost, energy products from anaerobic digestion, including transportation fuel, electricity or gas used for heating, and electricity from biomass conversion. The regulations do outline specific details as to what makes these products eligible for procurement, so I do encourage you to take a close read at that regulatory text. But the key is that these products are made from California landfill diverted organic waste, and that they are made at specific types of facilities or operations as specified in the regulations. And jurisdictions are required to undertake this procurement. So for the recovered organic waste products, jurisdictions are defined as cities, counties, or cities and counties. So how much of these products does each city and county need to procure? CalRecycle will assign an annual procurement target to each jurisdiction based on their population. The formula you see here is from the regulations and demonstrates how a jurisdiction's procurement target is calculated and how conversion factors are then used to convert this procurement target into quantities of end products. A jurisdiction's population is multiplied by a per capita procurement factor defined in the regulations as 0.08 tons of organic waste per person. And the result is a jurisdiction's procurement target measured in tons of organic waste. Every 5 years, a jurisdiction's procurement target will be recalculated to account for changes in their population. The regulations then outline conversion factors that are used to convert that jurisdiction's procurement target into actual quantities of recovered organic waste products. So to determine this end quantity, a jurisdiction would multiply their target by these conversion factors. We built in multiple options into the procurement requirements to provide jurisdictions with flexibility in meeting their procurement target. So in keeping with this theme, jurisdictions can customize their procurement and can choose what mix of products they'd like to procure to meet their target. So they can meet their target entirely through one product or through a mix of products. This slide further highlights additional procurement options that were built into the regulations. Jurisdictions can meet their target either through direct procurement, in which they are directly using the products themselves or giving it away, or through a direct service provider, in which the jurisdiction has a written contract or agreement with an entity such as a hauler or contractor to procure these eligible products on behalf of the jurisdiction. So an example of this could be is if a city has a contract with a landscaping company to use eligible mulch or compost products and requires in that contract that these products meet the regulatory requirements and are being procured on behalf of the city, this could count towards the city's procurement target. An important thing to emphasize is that procurement does not necessarily mean purchase. A jurisdiction that produces its own eligible products or receives it in another way, such as free delivery from their contracted hauler, such as with compost, and then uses this product can count this towards their procurement target. And it's also important to note that procurement can be what we call a paper transaction. So the products that are procured by the jurisdiction do not have to be produced within their jurisdiction, made from their own collected organic waste, or even used within the jurisdiction. So a jurisdiction, for example, could purchase eligible compost made from anywhere in the state and use this towards their target. Lastly, CalRecycle has built a mechanism into the regulations where their target can be lowered to ensure that a jurisdiction does not procure more recovered organic waste products than it can use. So this was included because the intent of these requirements is not to force jurisdictions to purchase or acquire more than they actually have a need for. A jurisdiction may qualify for this adjusted procurement target if their calculated procurement target exceeds their previous year's procurement of energy products. So this would be their previous year's procurement of transportation fuel, electricity, or gas used for heating. And this mechanism will be triggered by a jurisdiction as part of their annual report, and the jurisdiction must keep records of that previous year's energy product procurement and report this to CalRecycle to support that reduced procurement target. Next slide, please. This slide shows just a few examples of how a jurisdiction may use these products to meet their goals. For compost and mulch, these may be used for things such as erosion control, as a soil amendment or soil cover in parks or open spaces. A jurisdiction could also host compost or mulch giveaways, and this can count towards their procurement target. For transportation fuel from renewable gas from anaerobic digestion, this could be used to fuel any transportation needs of the jurisdiction, such as in their bus or waste fleets, or if they have a direct service provider agreement with an entity such as their franchise waste hauler to use this fuel, this could also count towards their target. A jurisdiction can use renewable gas for any heating needs, such as space heating, cooking, or to heat equipment such as the digesters themselves. And electricity from biomass conversion or from renewable gas from anaerobic digestion could be used to power any needs, such as on-site at an organics recycling facility, any other buildings or infrastructure used by the jurisdiction or by their direct service providers. Jurisdictions are required to maintain records so that CalRecycle can verify compliance as needed. These records include things such as the name, physical location, and contact information of the entities from whom products were procured, a general description of how products were used, and invoices or similar records of procurement for both direct procurement and for direct service providers. Please note there are additional record-keeping requirements outlined in the regulations for certain products, including mulch and energy products from wastewater treatment facilities or from biomass conversion. So do take a look at those regulatory requirements. The second part of the procurement requirements are for the procurement of recycled content paper, and these are separate from the recovered organic waste product requirements that we've discussed so far. Unlike the requirements discussed so far, these procurement requirements are a blanket requirement for all paper purchases. So there is no target of how much paper purchases need to be made. Rather, all purchases must meet these requirements. And another important distinction is that this does include a broader scope of jurisdictions that are subject to these requirements. So it is not just cities, counties, or cities and counties who are required to procure recycled content paper, but also special districts that provide solid waste collection services. SB 1383 builds upon existing requirements, which many local entities already meet, such as to purchase minimum recycled content paper products. However, some new requirements added are that paper purchases must be recyclable under the Federal Trade Commission guidance, meaning that a substantial majority of the population where these products are sold have access to recycling programs for these products at the end of their useful life. Another requirement that's added is that jurisdictions must require the vendors from whom they purchase these products to provide certifications of the minimum post-consumer content in these products and that they are recyclable. And there are a variety of product types outlined in the definitions of paper products and printing and writing paper included in our regulatory text. So please take a look at that, but it's a wide range of products and includes things such as paper, janitorial supplies, cartons, packaging, file folders, envelopes, and most printing and writing paper. And there are also record-keeping requirements for recycled content paper purchases. This includes things such as copies of invoices, receipts, or other proofs of purchase that describes the procurement of paper purchases. So this will include the volume and type of paper purchases, and also those copies of those certifications or other verifications as necessary from their vendors. So that is documenting the post-consumer content requirement and that the products are recyclable. This slide gives a timeline for SB 1383 implementation. Here in red are some important dates for procurement, and the procurement requirements do become enforceable in 2022 with the rest of the regulations. Rural jurisdictions and jurisdictions located within rural counties that are exempt from the organic waste collection requirements will not be required to comply with the recovered organic waste product procurement requirements until 2027. So that is an important thing to keep in mind, that there is a delay of implementation for those groups. However, all jurisdictions, including rural jurisdictions, will be required to comply with the recycled content paper procurement requirements beginning in 2022. And jurisdictions will be informed annually of their procurement target through posting on our website and through direct written notification. Jurisdictions can calculate their procurement targets through the formula outlined in the regulations. However, their official procurement targets for 2022 will be taken into account newer population data than is currently available. However, we do expect this data to become available in May of this year, and CalRecycle will be providing notice to jurisdictions of their official targets following the release of this data. And the procurement target for each jurisdiction is recalculated every 5 years to account for changes in population. So the procurement target for the year of 2022 will be in effect for 5 years until 2027. And there are requirements included in Article 13 of the regulations for jurisdictions to report to CalRecycle. For procurement, the first instance of reporting is in the initial compliance report, and this is only if jurisdictions are procuring mulch. This is a one-time compliance report, and it is to report to CalRecycle a copy of a jurisdiction's ordinance or other enforceable mechanism adopted if they are procuring mulch, and that's outlining that mulch procured does meet various requirements. However, all other reporting will take place through the annual reporting, and this will include the amount of each recovered organic waste product procured in the previous calendar year. And if a jurisdiction is implementing a reduced procurement target, they'll also need to report those quantities of energy products procured in that previous calendar year prior to that compliance year. Next slide, please. Lastly, this slide highlights some of the tools and resources that are currently available to help jurisdictions implement the procurement requirements. The Procurement Calculator tool was recently released on our website and through our listserv, and can be used by jurisdictions to calculate their procurement targets and the quantities of recovered organic waste products they'll need to procure to meet this target. It may be helpful to jurisdictions in planning for their procurement and tracking their progress towards meeting their targets. We did host a webinar for this tool in early February, but it was recorded in case you missed it. But we will be releasing this on our website shortly, so please ensure you are signed up through our SLCP listserv, and we'll announce when that recorded training is available. The Model Procurement Policy is another tool available to jurisdictions. It is a customizable template for jurisdictions who are planning to develop and adopt a procurement policy, and can be customized to reflect what specific products a jurisdiction plans to procure and how they plan to carry out this policy. We also have some case studies highlighted on our website of jurisdictions that are already taking actions towards compliance, and some other resources and web content that should be helpful to jurisdictions. Please let us know if there are any resources you'd like to see highlighted on our website, and stay tuned through our SLCP listserv for more to come. Next slide, please. Awesome. So that's it for my presentation. As I noted, please be sure you are signed up through our SLCP listserv to stay up to date on all developments, including future webinars or release of tools. This presentation was a pretty quick overview, but if you need further information, of course, please reach out with questions today or contact us through our SLCP inbox, and check out our webpage. And thanks so much for listening in. We're really excited to have this opportunity today to hear from our Bay Area stakeholders and other folks tuning in from across the state. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions that may be out of the box and with some nuance that we haven't considered. So some of these we may need to take offline and get back to you at a later date. But if this is the case, we will follow up with you. And also for today's Q&A session, we will be focusing on implementation and clarification questions. So we won't be addressing the merits or reasoning behind the language that was developed in regulations. So that's something to also keep in mind for your questions today. And before we open up the floor, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Kristen Pidcock, and she will touch on a number of our most frequently asked questions that we regularly address and can hopefully help answer some of your questions off the bat and guide some of your questions for today's Q&A session. So take it away, Kristen.
Thank you, Michelle. Great presentation. As Michelle said, we are excited for the opportunity to hear from you today and listen to some of your thoughts and questions. We really do hope these sessions will be helpful for you as you begin implementation. So I'm going to go over a few of our frequently asked questions that we receive on procurement on a regular basis right now. So the first question is, how can a jurisdiction meet their procurement target? So for example, if a jurisdiction's organic waste is going to a compost facility, can that count as procurement? So the regulations outline that procurement is achieved through the end use or giveaway of recovered organic waste products. So simply diverting your waste to a compost facility doesn't quite meet procurement. The intent of the procurement is to encourage the demand and use of these products, which helps close a loop because this is where the most environmental benefits are realized. Another question we receive regarding what can count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target is when there is an entity in a jurisdiction that's using recovered organic waste products. So an example of this would be if the local waste hauler fuels its trucks with eligible transportation fuel derived from renewable gas. Can that count towards the procurement target? So in that situation, it could be eligible, but there would need to be an established direct service provider relationship for this to be an option. So there would need to be a written agreement or a contract in place defining this direct service provider relationship between the jurisdiction and the end user. So if there's not that written agreement and a relationship established, then that external entity is not considered part of the jurisdiction. So that would not count towards the procurement target. The next question is, in what circumstances does mulch count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target? So mulch is an eligible product in procurement if it meets the requirements outlined in the regulation. So among other things, the mulch must be produced at specific permitted facilities, and it must comply with land application standards. And this requirement for it to be produced at permitted facilities is to ensure that these products are being made from diverted solid waste, as well as helping support the landfill diversion goals of SB 1383. So you may have noticed that the chipping and grinding operations are excluded. And this is because feedstocks typically entering these facilities are not considered or defined as landfill diverted. The last question I have here is, under what circumstances can gas produced at a POTW or publicly owned wastewater treatment facility count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target? And there are several requirements outlined in the regulation, but the key to remember is that this renewable gas must be produced from landfill diverted organic waste. So this water treatment facility would need to be accepting eligible diverted organics from specific permitted solid waste facilities or operations. And then the portion of the gas produced from those diverted organic wastes is what may count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target. So I know that was brief, but with that, those are just a few frequently asked questions that we get, and hopefully it was helpful in addressing some of the questions you may have. And if you do have more, we have our team here today to help answer those questions for you today. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to hand it back to Julie right now to get us started on the Q&As.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Kristen, for your wonderful presentations. So again, this is just a reminder on the slide of how the Q&A session is going to go. We are going to start off the session from a question that came in from the SLCP inbox, and this is from Patty Toes. And Patty, after I read your question, I will unmute you if you want to add any context to your question as well. So Patty's question is, when will CalRecycle send out jurisdictions' procurement targets?
Thanks for your question, Patty. So as mentioned in my presentation, we expect that the population data from the Department of Finance, which is what we base those procurement targets off of, we expect that data to become available in May of 2021. So coming up shortly, and that will be the data used to calculate jurisdictions' official procurement targets. So we will be using that, and then we'll be notifying jurisdictions of their official targets. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much. Okay, our next question is from Anthony. Anthony, if you would like to unmute and state your affiliation and ask your question, please. Anthony, you are unmuted, but we can't hear you. Okay, Anthony's question was, since janitorial products are not typically accepted in recycling. Oh, yes.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. My question is about recyclability and not recycled content on the paper. Given that pretty much every recycling program does not accept janitorial papers, how can a jurisdiction buy janitorial papers legally starting January 1st?
That question. We've received this question a number of times recently, and we are going to be opining on this subject in particular, hopefully soon.
Oh, Scott, I think your mic might be down or up. I mean, you're a little bit quiet.
Okay, let's see. Sound better?
Yeah, there you go.
Great. All right. Sorry about that. So we've received this question a number of times recently, and we are discussing it with our legal counsel, and so we're hoping to put out some guidance specifically on janitorial supplies as it pertains to the procurement requirements. That said, it's important to be aware that the recyclability requirement it could include traditional recycling or composting of products as meeting the recyclability requirement. But we acknowledge that this is a bit of a gray area in terms of guidance, and we hope to provide more guidance soon.
We look forward to it. Thanks.
Our next question is from Maria. You can now unmute yourself and please state your affiliation.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi, this is Ria Varghese from the city of San Jose. And I had a couple of questions. One was for facilities that serve more than one jurisdiction, who can actually claim credit for like renewable gas that's generated or like compost produced from organic material that's diverted from our landfill? What would be the appropriate process to sort of go ahead with trying to get credit for that material or gas?
Good question, Ria. I'll go ahead and take a stab at it, and Scott, feel free to jump in. So the requirement is for jurisdictions to undertake that procurement. So the city or county can make arrangements of procuring eligible products themselves. They can also procure through what we've defined as a direct service provider, in which they have a contract or written agreement with another entity to procure those products on behalf of the jurisdiction. So if a separate entity, private group is producing eligible products such as a composting facility, it will be, who is then procuring those products from that facility that will get credit for procuring. And it will be, up to contracting. If, a facility wants to contract as a direct service provider with multiple jurisdictions and wants to procure on behalf of multiple jurisdictions, it'll be up to, contracting to get all that outlined and on paper. And it is separate from, how much of your organic waste is being sent to a facility for recycling. So if multiple jurisdictions are sending their organic waste, for example, to a composting facility, it's not that counts towards procurement. It's then, those products that are then procured back, or those products that are procured through a direct service provider that is then what's fulfilling the procurement requirements.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is that, the regulations don't dictate how procurement should be split or attributed in the cases of, a facility or a direct service provider that serves multiple jurisdictions. So that's going to be, left up to contracting and to, the jurisdictions hopefully working together with their contractor and direct service provider to come up with a fair solution, whatever that is.
Could I have a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
Well, so does the compost, for example, actually need to be applied, or do we just need to have an agreement that we're buying X tons of compost?
So the compost needs to be procured for use or giveaway. And so in addition to that requirement, there are record-keeping requirements, including generally how the eligible products were used, where they were used, et cetera. So, it's important to review both the eligibility portions of regulations as well as the record-keeping requirements, because the record-keeping really gets into the detail of how records, on which records need to be kept, and that's the kind of complicating factor when you start thinking about direct service providers. Is how is the jurisdiction going to maintain and keep the records and be able to report to CalRecycle and meet their requirements if they're working through a third party? So that just needs to be worked out between the jurisdiction and a direct service provider.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Frank. Frank, if you would like to unmute and state your affiliation and ask your question, please.
Yes, hi, my name is Frank Orlett. And my question is, as a direct service provider to a city with a contract to procure organic waste products, is there a requirement that specifies how the service provider can use the recovered organic material?
Great question, Frank. The regulations don't describe, what specific activities have to be taken with the eligible products. So it doesn't say it has to be applied at, for compost, for example, has to be applied in certain spaces, or for fuel that it has to fuel certain types of transportation vehicles. So they don't speak to that. So it's it'll be what's worked out.
Thank you.
With the.
Thank you. As a follow-up,
Sure.
I'm vice president with Vertec, but with a follow-up to that. So if we have a contract with a third-party compost facility and a contract with the city to procure their procurement products, and the compost facility moves the products to wherever it is, gift gardeners, farmers, et cetera, that is acceptable.
Yeah, in the direct service provider language in statute, in regulation, the use or giveaway, the actual procurement needs to be on behalf of the jurisdiction, and it needs to be in written agreement and all these other regulatory requirements. So the key is that those requirements are met, and where the regs are silent, they're silent, and there's a fair amount of flexibility. But what it really comes down to, of course, it's meeting the letter of the regulation, obviously.
I'm sorry, just one more, if I can just do one more. So the compost facility, as long as we contractually have the contracts with the compost facility to procure it on behalf of the city, and a contract with the city, because we're a direct service provider to the city, we're a hauler, how the compost facility markets it to gardeners or to farmers or to other entities that use it for a beneficial use, it's okay. It's not dictated how they market that material.
So you're talking a little bit more about.
But if the compost facility if they sold it to the farmer, would it make any difference?
I think the user application or giveaway needs to be on behalf of the jurisdiction in regulation. So your scenario is an interesting one that I think we'll have to give a little bit more thought to. And if you'd like, we could have a follow-up one-on-one conversation. And then that would anything we learned from that and guidance we'd give, we would spread more widely as well.
Okay, thank you.
Definitely an interesting question.
Then sorry, didn't mean to hog the time.
Thanks.
Okay, our next question is from Kelly. Kelly, if you can please unmute, state your affiliation, ask your question, please.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
Which question? I have a bunch.
So the one I see is about fog.
Okay, great. Kelly Schoonmaker, Stop Waste. Here's my question. I'm just confirming fog, fats, oils, and grease would be a 1383 eligible feedstock for RNG products, right? Because it is considered.
So, for broader 1383, fog is an identified organic waste. For procurement regulations, the eligible products needs to be produced depending on what facility you're talking about. Are you talking about a wastewater treatment plant?
Yeah, let's say it's a wastewater treatment plant. Everything else is in order, right? Like all the paper trail satisfies everything. There's an agreement with the city that whoever's using the electricity generated from that RNG is using it at the behest of that city. Let's say everything else is okay, and some of that electricity is from RNG from food waste, some is from fog. Does the fog part count?
I love the caveat of if everything else is met, because I say that a lot. So we don't specify individual waste types in our procurement regs that are eligible. It needs to be an organic recovered organic waste, and B, it needs to be in a case of a POTW, they can only count the energy that's produced from the tonnage that's received from an eligible facility. And those facilities include compostable material handling operations, transfer processing facilities. So my interpretation, and hopefully don't need to backpedal this, but my interpretation is that, if in as much as fog is transferred or comes from one of these eligible facilities, I don't see why that wouldn't be an eligible product that's made from it. But my understanding is that FOG is not routed through a compostable material handling operation or transfer processing facilities or solid waste landfills. So it's skeptical that there will be much FOG that would be eligible due to that requirement.
So Scott, would that mean that if you had food waste that was self-hauled to a wastewater treatment plant or another AD facility that didn't go through a transfer station or landfill, that wouldn't count? That doesn't seem like the intent of this.
Correct. Right,
what?
Michelle? Yeah, and so in food waste, that's I think we could probably get a lot more into this offline, but the intent of the procurement part of 1383 regs is to create a market for end products that result in that end up resulting in landfill diversion. The types of kind of liquid and high strengths food wastes, like liquid wastes that get self-hauled from industrial food processing operations to wastewater treatment plant, classically have not been landfilled. Especially liquid wastes it's rare to be able to landfill liquid wastes, except for in very specific cases. So that's how the regulations were targeted in this for this mechanism.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, our next question is from Matt. Matt doesn't have audio, so I will ask the question for him. My jurisdiction has a larger urban forest, and we process tree pruning and tree removal into mulch. We are being told that this is self-generated mulch will not count towards our target. This means we have to send it by hauler as waste so it can be recovered, then sent back to us. This is a significant waste of taxpayer dollars. What can we do to avoid these inefficient efforts?
Great question, Matt. So there, in the regulations, there are specified facilities that from where mulch can be sourced in order for mulch to be an eligible product. So those do include a compostable material handling operation or facility, transfer processing facility, or a solid waste landfill. And those specific facilities are included as, the intent is to ensure we are, creating markets for products for organic waste that would have otherwise been landfilled and is instead, being directed to these solid waste facilities for recycling, for recovery. And so, typical, chipped ground material by, that's not going through those channels is not typically destined for landfill in the first place. So it's not helping to create, additional demand for these products that are instead more so landfill diverted. Hopefully that helps, Matt.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is, the procurement regs are but one piece of 1383, and they were intended to create some demand and an actual end market for a portion of what's needed to meet 1383. And the select products and the select sources that are eligible are just a small part of what's going on in the state. And there's nothing that precludes a city or county or jurisdiction from continuing doing things that won't necessarily meet their procurement target. But again, in developing regs, we have to tie it back to the enabling statutory language, which is reducing landfilling in California and reducing the short-lived climate pollutants from landfills.
Our next question is from Ria. Ria, you are now unmuted. Please ask your question and state your affiliation.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm Ria Varghese from the city of San Jose. My question
Oh, sorry, Ria.
Procurement credit. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you cut out right as you were asking your question. So let me
Oh,
start.
sorry.
Okay.
Can the jurisdiction be able to get procurement credit from purchasing renewable energy certificates, so like RECs from biogas or biomass conversion? Occasionally, this in our case, the city's community choice energy provider purchases an electricity that's not traceable to a specific generating facility. And so those unspecified sources of power are typically a mix of all resources and may include renewables, and so we find out after the fact where it's come from. Would we be able to take credit for that?
So in the case of energy, it can be what's called a paper transaction. You can purchase energy as usual from your local utility, but you can work directly with the producer of energy somewhere in the state, as long as it's meeting all the requirements and in state from eligible sources, and attribute the electricity that they're producing to your use. It doesn't necessarily have to go. The paper trail doesn't have to go all the way and follow those electrons all the way to you. But in the case of RECs themselves, RECs are not in of themselves eligible to be attributed towards a jurisdiction's procurement requirement, because for a generator to earn a REC, they don't have to meet these specific requirements. RECs can be from out-of-state sources, et cetera, et cetera. So the key here is looking back at regulations and the record-keeping requirements that a jurisdiction is going to have to keep. So as a jurisdiction, look at the records that you'll have to keep on the products that you're purchasing, especially on energy, and figure out, okay, how am I going to be able to document these requirements and keep these records if I'm buying energy from a utility. There will have to be either a direct, arrangement with the producer of the utility or of the energy, or the utility, if there's demand, a utility could create some sort of paper trail for their customers. But right now, as far as I know, no utilities have stepped up to do that because of lack of demand or lack of interest. So we'll see if that actually happens.
So I guess just going back to like the electricity generated, so in our particular case, the facility where we have a contract with, they sell their electricity back to PG&E. So how would we be able to get credit for the electricity that's generated in that case?
It would be an agreement with, as per regulations, an agreement with the producer of that energy that attributes that production of that electricity to your use of electricity. And so again, it's the energy sector. The way that paper trails work is very different from actual organics, and so it gets a little bit strange, but the key is that the regulatory language on record keeping, and especially with regards to the sources of the products, and that the products were made from eligible materials and sources, is met. I wish I could give more guidance and more examples of this, but nobody's really done this yet. It's an option within procurement to do this, but the initial concept of procuring energy was really focused around more direct relationships, where you buy energy from a electricity generator that's next door, or it's your own facility that you're generating energy and using it yourself, or those types of things. Luckily, we were able to open it up to a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more out of the box thinking. But as you get a little bit farther out of that box, it gets a little bit more complicated and very case by case. So I definitely recommend working with your legal counsel on reviewing the requirements, ultimately how a jurisdiction is going to be held accountable under these requirements, and seeing how you can contract or make agreements with producers of these products to meet all of these requirements.
Okay, thank you. Well, I guess that kind of answered one of my other questions, because I was wondering if you were going to develop like model documents or like procurement agreements, or
You know, we're not opposed to sharing more widely examples of when people have done this. We just haven't seen that yet. And so we are excited to see how how jurisdictions are able to leverage the flexibility within these requirements to do some out-of-the-box thinking, like, for instance, carbon farming and direct service provider relationships and things like that. And so we're excited to see what kind of happens there and to spread the word about specific case studies when those happen.
okay, thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Susan. Susan, if you would like to unmute, state your affiliation, ask your question, please.
Let me just say, Bay Area, these are some tough questions. Good job, guys. I'm sweating here.
Okay, Susan's question is, does the state have any purchasing agreements for recycled content paper that local jurisdictions can get in on for volume discounts?
Good question, Susan. We are in development of a web page for on CalRecycle's website, specifically dedicated to recycled content paper requirements and resources. And one that we have included and that I can think of off the top of my head as a potential resource is, I know the Department of General Services does have some different procurement agreements and contracts noted on their website. So that will be one of the resources that we provide and may be of interest to local jurisdictions. And I believe is open to for local public entities to have access to those. So hopefully that's in line with a resource you're looking for.
Our next question is from Jack. Jack, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question regarding the procurement target and state your affiliation. So Jack's question is, how would a jurisdiction determine whether or not the procurement target is greater than the amount recovered organic waste products that a jurisdiction needs? Could you provide a hypothetical? Can you hear me, Jack? I see you're trying to talk.
Oh, hi, I'm Jack Steinman. I'm with the San Mateo County Office of Sustainability. Thank you for asking my question. And
Thanks for your question, Jack. So our regulations, it does include a mechanism for jurisdictions to adjust their procurement target. And right, we use the phrasing of if it is, exceeding the amount that a jurisdiction has a need or a use for. So this mechanism is based on a jurisdiction's previous year's procurement of energy products. So transportation fuel, electricity, or gas use for heating. A jurisdiction could show that, so for example, for the first year of compliance for 2022, they could use those records of procurement of those energy products for 2021, and then they would sort of back calculate that into what those quantities of products would look like in quantities of like tons of organic waste, which is what our procurement target is measured in. So you kind of back calculate it and show that the calculated target actually is exceeding, what a jurisdiction's need is, based off of those energy products. So a jurisdiction would need to keep records of that previous year's procurement of those products and would need to report to CalRecycle those previous year's procurement quantities to support that lowered adjusted target. But that is a mechanism included that can be hopefully helpful to some jurisdictions.
thank you. And so at least for the jurisdiction I work with, I assume we will not qualify for this just based off of our energy consumption or our electricity consumption. But even if there's not enough RNG or biomass conversion energy for us to meet our procurement target that way, would we still be able to acquire the amount of compost or mulch to meet our procurement target, even if our jurisdiction doesn't need, say, thousands of tons of compost each year?
I think I might have an idea of your question, Jack. Sorry if I'm not answering it exactly to what you're getting at, but so to adjust their procurement target, it is based off of those previous year's procurement of energy products, but a jurisdiction can certainly meet their target or their adjusted target through things such as compost or mulch. So hopefully that helps clarify a little.
Yes, yeah, my concern is just...
Sorry about that. Yeah, regardless of which, whether a jurisdiction has their official target or a adjusted target, they can meet that target through a combination of any of these eligible products.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question is from Deborah. Deborah, if you would like to unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi there, this is Deborah Miller from Recycle Smart, and I think I answered the question myself, but I want to make sure. I'm curious about whether JPA's joint powers agencies have procurement obligations in addition to and separate from their member agencies. And if I'm reading correctly, for organics, the answer is no, because a joint powers agency is not a city, a county, or a city and county. But for recycled content paper, the answer is yes, because we're a jurisdiction.
You got it.
Perfect, thank you.
Great.
Our next question is from Brandon. Brandon, please unmute yourself and state your affiliation.
My name is Brandon Moffat from Stormfisher. Question I've got is, you have RNG being sold into California or from sites in California to produce LCFS credits. You also have SB 1440, which is under discussion for an RNG mandate to the natural gas utilities. And you have the renewable natural gas procurement that's required of the municipalities for SB 1383. In that case, are the municipalities competing against those other programs for this RNG, or how do they work together, or how is there alignment amongst those programs?
That's a great question. In short, these procurement requirements under 1383 don't require additionality to other programs. So, and fuel that has LCFS or RINs attached to it that's utilized, whether that RIN has been contracted and is earned by somebody else or not, or how that's arranged, has no bearing on whether it can count for a jurisdiction's procurement target.
Okay, our next question is from Jack. Again, Jack, you are unmuted. And this was your question about community compost.
Hi, Jack Steinman again, San Mateo County Office of Sustainability. I'm just wondering if compost generated by community compost operations can be counted towards the jurisdiction's procurement target, since that material is often being diverted from the landfill.
Thank you for the question. There's the requirements for compost in procurement and for eligible compost are that it's from specific facility types as outlined in the regulations. And so I'm not super familiar with how the range of ways that community composting site could be permitted. It could range from being excluded to having some kind of notification or other permit, is my understanding. But to be eligible for a jurisdiction to count towards the procurement requirement, it needs to be one of the facility types identified in regulations. And that is, it's in the first page or so of Article 2. I think it's 18983.1 F1 identifies the different types, the facility types that the compost needs to be from.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to jump in here, Scott. This is a very similar question with a similar answer. But this question is from Lillian Clark, and this is from the SLCP inbox. Her question is, how does home composting / composting bins fit into the regs, and how can it be accounted for in terms of diversion? If they are using their compost on site, does it count towards procurement?
Yeah, similar answer we're going to speak specifically to a jurisdiction's ability to count a product procured towards the procurement target. In that case, home composting that's not permitted or notification tier and not identified in regulations, that material wouldn't be able to count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target. Now, I think the question touched on a couple different things on how being counted as diversion and other things, and that's outside the scope of procurement itself.
All right, thank you so much, Scott. So I've got one more from the SLCP inbox. This is from James Dunbar. He is with Lystec. His question is, what is the process for getting alternative products, not just compost, as an approved diversion and procurement material?
Great question. We get this a lot. The regulations are what they are. They have these specific products identified, and we don't have any ability within the current regulations to add additional products without opening up regulations. And so I think that's about all I can say on that. There's so many great opportunities in the state that are really important to meeting diversion goals and sort of climate pollutant goals that aren't included in our procurement regulations. The procurement targets and the materials that are selected through the public process, through the regulatory process, are just a small part of what we do need to reach our goals in 1383. But again, the procurement, the eligible products at this time were focused on specific products from specific sources that CalRecycle through the stakeholder process identified that needed the most support and resulted most directly in landfill diversion.
And one thing to add as well, and your question got at a little bit, James, regarding different activities counting towards diversion and a reduction in landfill disposal. There, as you may be aware of, Article 2 and a process in that to have other activities kind of counting as a reduction in landfill disposal. So that is separate from procurement, but I do encourage you to check out that section regarding your question on diversion. And yeah, Scott works in a little bit with that as well, so we can have follow-up conversations on that.
That is a great note. And the Article 2 process is, it's a regulatory process that has been outlined through our regulations that allows us to assess on a GHG basis additional technologies that may count as diversion. But again, that has technologies that are added through that process there's not a similar process for procurements to add additional products or processes.
All right, thank you both. So we're going to finish up with one last question. And this question is from Ruben. And Ruben, I will unmute you. And just to remind you, this is your question about AD and water treatment facilities.
Yeah, thank you. I'm with Marine Sanitary Service. My question is, if a hauler provides service in different jurisdictions, and collects food waste in all of the jurisdictions for a food waste diversion program to generate renewable electricity through AD at a water treatment facility. And all the jurisdictions where the hauler operates use the program towards compliance with the procurement requirement. And if not, which jurisdiction can use this program to meet that procurement requirement? Thank you.
Great. Yeah. And so we talked a little bit about this earlier, but to put a kind of a fine point on it, a facility that serves multiple jurisdictions, a direct service provider relationship would need to be established for energy procured and used or given away, or other products, for it to count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target. And how that is split up between jurisdictions and attributed and record keeping associated with that is really up to the jurisdictions and the service provider to work out contractually. The end result just needs to meet the language in the regulation for record keeping. I think there was a little bit more buried in your question as well. What did I miss? I think that's about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Scott, Kristen, and Michelle, and everyone for your great questions. We will continue to answer some of those questions in the question feature and GoToWebinar, so be sure to keep checking that for your responses. So I'm Julia Doloff. I work in local assistance and market development, and I'm going to jump right into the collections requirements. So jurisdictions are required to provide an organic waste collection service to all residents and businesses. This is what we refer to as automatically providing service or universal service. The resident or business is automatically provided the service rather than having to subscribe to it, and the resident or business must participate in that service unless they have been granted a waiver by the jurisdiction. Jurisdictions can comply with the regulations by providing a 3+, a 3, a 2, or a single unsegregated container service. They can also use a combination of services. A 3-container service requires a jurisdiction to provide each generator with a green, blue, and gray container. The green container is for the collection of organic waste. The blue is for the collection of non-organic recyclables, but may include paper products, wood and dry lumber, and textiles. And the gray container is for all other non-organic waste. The jurisdiction may provide additional containers or split containers for further source separation. A jurisdiction may allow use of plastic bags to collect food waste or compostable plastics in the green container if the facilities the jurisdiction uses to recover the organic waste provides written notice to the jurisdiction that it can process or remove the plastic bags or compostable plastic. In a 2-container collection service, a jurisdiction may either provide a green and a gray container or a gray and a blue container. Under a gray and green container service, the green container is limited to organic waste only, and the gray container allows for the commingling of all other collected waste. Under a blue and gray container service, the blue is limited to traditional recyclables and may include paper products, wood and dry lumber, and textiles, while the gray container is for all other collected waste. In both scenarios, the contents of the gray container must be sent to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. In an unsegregated single container collection service, a jurisdiction may provide a gray container that allows for the commingling of all waste. The contents of the gray container must be transported to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. CalRecycle will be using RDRS data to identify these facilities, and this information will be provided to jurisdictions. If a high diversion organic waste processing facility has an organic content recovery rate less than the 50% required by 2022 or 75% required by 2025 for 2 consecutive quarterly reporting periods or 3 quarterly reporting periods within 3 years, then the facility will not qualify as a high diversion organic waste processing facility. If a jurisdiction is in violation due to its high diversion facility being out of compliance, the jurisdiction will be subject to the enforcement process. In this scenario, the jurisdiction must commit to one of three options: bringing the facility back into compliance, using a different high diversion facility, or implementing a 3-container collection service. In a 3 and 2 container collection service, jurisdictions are required to monitor containers for contaminants. Contamination monitoring must be done for both residential and commercial routes. A jurisdiction can monitor contamination by conducting route reviews or waste evaluations. Jurisdictions that choose to conduct route reviews must review all hauler routes annually. Containers may be randomly selected along a hauler route, and cameras can be used to remotely monitor containers. Upon finding contaminants, the jurisdiction must notify the generator of the violation. Note that the regulations do not require a jurisdiction to impose administrative civil penalties on generators who are in violation of the container contaminants requirements. However, the regulations do allow jurisdictions to impose contamination processing fees or penalties for contamination. Waste evaluations are a facility-based container contamination compliance method. This is the alternative to conducting route reviews. Evaluations must be done at least twice per year and must occur in 2 distinct seasons. The evaluations must include samples of each container type, so all container colors, and the samples must be taken from different areas in the jurisdiction that are representative of the jurisdiction's waste stream. The regulations specify the minimum number of samples from all the hauler routes that must be included in the evaluation from each container type. If the sampled weight of container contaminants exceeds 25% of the measured sample for any container type, the jurisdiction must either notify generators on the sampled routes of the requirement to properly sort, or perform a targeted route review of containers on the sampled routes to determine the sources of contamination, then notify those generators of their obligation to properly sort. Note that a jurisdiction that is implementing a performance-based, source-separated collection service, which is outlined in Article 17, must conduct waste evaluations at least twice per year for the blue and green containers and once per quarter for the gray container. The regulations standardize container colors. The color scheme is either the lid is the required color, or the body is the required color, and the lid is the required color, or gray or black. A jurisdiction is not required to replace functional containers that do not comply with the color requirements prior to the end of the useful life of those containers or prior to January 1, 2036, whichever comes first. If a container has minor repairs and remains functional, it does not need to be replaced prior to 2036. In 2022, a jurisdiction must place a label on each new container or new lid provided to generators. A jurisdiction must either place labels on the body or lid of the container with language, graphic images, or both that indicate the primary acceptable and primary prohibited materials for that container, or must provide imprinted text or graphic images on the container body or lid that indicate the primary acceptable and prohibited materials for that container. The labeling requirements apply to all containers, such as dumpsters, carts, debris bins, and roll-offs in the residential and commercial sectors. Organic waste generators must comply with local requirements by either subscribing to the organic waste collection service provided by the jurisdiction, or self-hauling organic waste in compliance with the regulations. Commercial businesses must provide containers for the collection of organic waste and non-organic recyclables in all areas where disposal containers are provided for customers, except restrooms. Businesses must provide collection containers that conform either to the colors of the jurisdiction service or have the required labels. Businesses must prohibit employees from placing organic waste in the wrong container and must periodically inspect containers for contamination. Generators are allowed to manage organic waste on site or use community scale composting activities. Commercial businesses, including multifamily dwellings, must provide or arrange for organic waste collection services for employees, contractors, tenants, and customers. This includes supplying and allowing access to an adequate number, size, and location of containers with the required labels or colors. Businesses must annually provide information to employees, contractors, tenants, and customers about organic waste recovery requirements and properly sorting material, and must provide information to new tenants before or within 14 days upon occupation of the premises. Businesses must provide access to their properties during inspections by the jurisdiction. The regulations allow jurisdictions to grant waivers to generators from the collection requirements. However, jurisdictions do not have to allow any or all of these waivers. Jurisdictions, not haulers, must administer the waivers. Waivers must be reviewed every 5 years by the jurisdiction. A jurisdiction may issue a de minimis waiver to a commercial business if the business is generating a de minimis amount of organic waste. De minimis amounts of waste are less than 20 gallons per week per applicable container for businesses that generate 2 cubic yards or more of total solid waste per week, and less than 10 gallons per week per applicable container for businesses that generate less than 2 cubic yards of total solid waste per week. A jurisdiction may issue a physical space waiver to a commercial business or property owner if the jurisdiction has evidence demonstrating that the premises lack adequate space for any of the organic waste container configurations. Finally, a jurisdiction may provide a collection frequency waiver, which allows a generator to subscribe to bi-weekly collection of its blue, gray, or both containers if the generator is using a service that requires the placement of all organic waste in the green container. A jurisdiction may issue the collection frequency waiver for the entire jurisdiction, specific areas of the jurisdiction, or an entire neighborhood. A jurisdiction may apply to CalRecycle for a waiver to waive some or all of the collection requirements. A jurisdiction may apply for a low population waiver if the jurisdiction disposed of less than 5,000 tons of solid waste in 2014 and the jurisdiction has a total population of less than 7,500 people. Census tracts located in an unincorporated county with a population density of less than 75 people per square mile also qualify for a low population waiver. Low population waivers must be reevaluated by the department every 5 years. CalRecycle must grant a rural exemption if a jurisdiction qualifies as a rural jurisdiction under AB 1826 and adopts a resolution finding that describes the purpose and need for the exemption. The duration of the rural exemption is until December 31st, 2026. After that, those jurisdictions may apply for the low population waivers if they meet those criteria. CalRecycle may grant an elevation waiver to a jurisdiction if the entire jurisdiction is located at or above an elevation of 4,500 feet. Census tracts located in an unincorporated county that are located at or above 4,500 feet may also apply for an elevation waiver. The census tract may be partially located at the elevation. Elevation waivers exempt generators from the requirement to separate and recover food waste and food soiled paper. High elevation jurisdictions are not required to provide generators with containers, as generators may continue to use their own customer or hauler provided containers that fit into their locked bear boxes. CalRecycle will be providing forms, guidance, and training sometime in the May or June timeframe so that jurisdictions can submit their waiver requests starting in September. The regulations establish conditions under which disaster and emergency circumstance waivers to temporarily dispose of organic waste may be granted by the jurisdiction. A jurisdiction is not required to separate or recover organic waste removed from homeless encampments and illegal disposal sites. The regulations outline 3 requirements that must be met to allow a jurisdiction to dispose of quarantined organic waste. And finally, these regulations do not require generators, jurisdictions, or other entities to manage or recover organic waste that federal law explicitly requires to be landfilled, such as solid waste from international flights. Counties and each city, regional agency, and special district that provides solid waste collection services within each county must plan for adequate capacity for recycling organic waste. Each county will lead this effort. The county is responsible for establishing a collaborative approach to planning, collecting organic waste recycling capacity information from each jurisdiction, submitting the organic waste recycling capacity report to CalRecycle, identifying any jurisdiction, including itself, that does not have enough organic waste recycling capacity, and informing any jurisdiction that does not have enough capacity the timeline for submitting its implementation schedule to CalRecycle. Capacity planning efforts must include the following materials: food, green waste, landscape and pruning waste, wood, paper products, digestate, and biosolids. And that concludes my very quick high-level overview presentation on the collection requirements. So we will now go into the Q&A session. So just again, a reminder to please review this slide for the instructions for how this session will go. And we will start off with a question that came in from the SLCP inbox. This is from Ali Abers, who is with Alameda County. Her question is, in a jurisdiction with no formal waste management franchise, for example, largely self-haulers or individual hauler contracts, is the jurisdiction responsible only for passing an ordinance and providing education, or is the jurisdiction also responsible for monitoring, reporting, and enforcement in these areas? We understand that some low population or de minimis area generators may qualify for waivers or exemptions, so we're not asking about requirements for food recovery or procurement in this question. So I'll hand that over to Kara to start us off.
Thanks, Julia. There's a lot to that question to unpack, so we may need to do a follow-up if we don't answer all of your questions. But yes, you are obligated to implement all aspects of the regulations, not just passing your ordinance. So, not knowing your particular situation, you may be in a situation where you are having to place requirements on your haulers to provide service, as Julia noted, to all residential and commercial generators. You're going to have to figure out the mechanism for how containers are provided and ensuring that, the phasing in of appropriate colored containers and labels on new containers. You'll have to also determine with your haulers as far as contamination minimization and how that will be handled. So there's likely a lot of changes that you may have to explore with your current situation, as it sounds like you may not have any direct requirements on your haulers, but you ultimately as the jurisdiction are responsible for implementing all of the various articles in the regulations. We can talk more if you are, I think you will have an area that will be eligible for a low population waiver, and we can talk about that and how that works with the rest of your jurisdiction. So feel free to contact your LAMD representative and we can set up a follow-up call to talk more about your specific situation. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you. And that LAMD contact is probably me. So look forward to that. So we'll hand it over to our two Sarahs for our next questions.
Our next question is from Ria. Ria, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, can
Yes, we can hear you.
well, I submitted a lot of questions, so is there a specific one but I'll start with the first one, I guess. So to go back to the self-hauler question that was just asked, I'm with the city of San Jose, sorry. Is the jurisdiction responsible for inspecting self-hauler records? So to what extent is the jurisdiction responsible for maintaining documents of self-haulers in the implementation record? And does adopting an ordinance to manage self-haulers fulfill the requirements of this article?
Great, thank you for your question. And then Alan can feel free to add as far as the implementation record goes. So first and foremost, yes, you are correct that if you are allowing self-haul, it must be included in the ordinance. There is not a specific requirement that you have to go and inspect self-haulers. So commercial self-haulers are required to keep a record of the amount of material that they recycle, facility, et cetera, and that's laid out in Article 7 of the self-hauler section of the regulations. That is provided in the event that you want to inspect that self-hauler to look at their record. So it's an optional choice for the jurisdiction. Residential self-haulers are not required to keep a record. Additionally, you are responsible for providing in your education outreach. If you allow self-hauling, you're supposed to provide in your outreach, what those requirements are for self-hauling. So you don't have to get records from self-haulers. You don't have to follow up with them individually, see if they're doing it right. You just need to have this in your ordinance, and you need to provide general education about the requirements. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Alan?
No, I think you covered it there. I guess streamlining there into the implementation record, the requirements, Rhea, it's a good question regarding the record keeping requirements. That's outlined in section 18988.4 with regards to any self-hauling that's associated within the implementation record. The implementation record needs to include a description of the jurisdiction's program and any requirements associated with its self-hauling and or backhauling, and that would be included within the implementation record portion.
So just a description, not...
Correct, the description of any requirements associated with the jurisdiction's self-hauling program.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Did you have another question?
Yeah, Rhea, you have a couple of questions.
Yes, I do.
So there's one on the container labeling requirements.
So the container labeling requirements, is that requirement only for new containers or lids, or does it apply to current containers and lids as well?
Sure, it is only new containers or lids, only new.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's
then
after January 1, 2022.
And then the next one I have is, so for our jurisdictions responsible for, so like customer facing containers, are jurisdictions responsible for enforcing those requirements to make sure that they match the containers used in the collection service? Because the regulation says the organic waste generators shall do ... but is the jurisdiction required to enforce that?
Sure. So the requirements are on the jurisdiction to conduct container contamination minimization. And you can do that in two ways. You can either do that through route reviews and then providing education to generators if they're not properly either putting materials, if you have a 3-container system, into the blue, green, or gray container, for example. Or you can do waste evaluations, and the process for conducting waste evaluations is laid out in the regulations. So it's either or. But the requirement is to provide education to generators. It is optional if a generator, if a jurisdiction wishes to issue additional processing fees for contamination or fees or penalties, but that is not required in the regulation. Did that answer your question?
I think so. And then I have one last question. So regarding container contamination minimization, you mentioned waste evaluations and route reviews. So can those methods be used for different years? So, or can two of them be used during the same year?
You could alternate. You don't have to stick with one or the other. The regulations are not specific to that. You have a lot of flexibility. I think that you would want to consider what is the most maybe cost-effective approach for your jurisdictions, for your jurisdiction, and make a decision that way versus kind of doing. You certainly wouldn't need to do both of them, but if you were trying to choose between one or the other, that would be important. You could look at cost, for example, and what that costs. Many jurisdictions who have collection service currently conduct route reviews. So that might be a good option, is to continue to conduct those route reviews and then just ensure that every route is inspected on an annual basis. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then just to confirm, the RDRS will be used to confirm whether a facility is a high diversion organic waste processing facility?
Yes, that is the plan. That is the plan. We have not determined for sure when the first data reports will start coming out, that will be listed on the website so that jurisdictions will know if their facility that they're using is a high diversion organic waste processing facility. As soon as we nail that down, we will provide that out to jurisdictions so you know. But it does take 4 quarters worth of data, so it's possible that the first report on that would be up in early 2023. But again, we're still working on that, and we'll be sure to communicate that to jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you.
Our next question is from Ruben. Ruben, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your affiliation.
Yeah, this is Ruben with Marine Sanitary Service, but Kara just answered my question. Yeah, thank you. I could ask it again if you want me to. But it was just basically I wanted to know if waste evaluations are the alternative to RAB reviews. You know, if you decide to do RAB reviews, then you don't have to do waste evaluations, correct?
Correct. It's an or statement. And I know, I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of folks, it's kind of confusing. It doesn't stand out clearly that it's either or. You can either do route reviews or you can do waste evaluations. You don't have to do both. Thanks for the question.
Thanks so much.
Okay, so it looks like Emmanuel has a question. Emmanuel, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Oh,
okay.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, go ahead.
All right, hi. Let's see, I had 2 questions about multifamily. So the first one is section 18984.9 B seems to exempt multifamily dwellings from having to put out public collection containers for organics and non-organic recyclables, even for staff of those multifamily dwellings. Why is that? And if an MFD has a number of staff, they could be producing food scraps and food sold paper every day with meals. So yeah, we're just curious why, the why.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the intention in that section, which the 18984.9, when we're talking about B and then the subsections under there, it was really designed because when we were thinking about multifamily complexes, multifamily complex wouldn't be going into residents' homes. So we weren't necessarily thinking about a multifamily complex's office per se. So that's why you need to also read section 18984.10. So this section would include any type of commercial business, including a multifamily complex. And so in that case, you would be providing the necessary containers, for example, necessary number, size, and location containers with sufficient labels or container color to meet the needs, for example, in the scenario you're providing for the employees. So I hope that, does that help answer that question, how those two sections kind of work together?
Yeah, sorry for the background noise. So you're saying that that we would need to provide those collection containers for the staff?
Yeah, exactly. That
Okay.
would be, well, let me say it this way. You are definitely required to ensure that there are proper containers. You're arranging for the service, and making sure there's access to the adequate, size, location of containers. So potentially that could apply to your multifamily complex office, but it's not specifically called out in the regulations as it is in point 9. But again, in this section in point 10, for example, the multifamily complex does have to provide information to its employees on how to properly recycle. And to have a good program, they would want to also provide for adequate containers. So I hope that is helpful. Also, along those lines, there is separate statute, which is AB 827, which also requires that commercial businesses that meet the requirements under 2 separate laws have to provide adequate containers with signage, etc. So while it may not be as specific here, there is another law which it would be applicable to. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you for bringing up 827. I think we've been thinking about it more in the commercial sense, or in the business sense, but not so much apartment buildings. So yeah, we'll look at that. And then my colleague, he also had a question related to 18984.10 and just getting details of how detailed we need to be. Let's see. Are there any details on information, the format, level of detail needed, or can multifamily buildings get away with just putting up signage or a few simple sentences like food, plants, and organics, plastic and paper and recycling, and everything else in garbage, as far as providing annual information to the employees, contractors, and tenants? Sorry.
Yeah. That's a really great question. So the regulations don't get super specific, but what we were envisioning is that as jurisdictions develop their educational materials, so in this case, like a multifamily complex, would want to collaborate with the jurisdictions. Many of our jurisdictions have educational materials that they can provide. And so I think that would be the nexus, because I think the information you're providing, one, you would want to save resources and utilize anything that the jurisdiction has already developed. So I would start with the jurisdiction and or the service provider, the hauler, to see if they have educational materials that you could just utilize. Does that help?
Sorry, I'm muting myself again. Yeah, so it sounds like the information that we have should be sufficient. We just need to share that with our apartment buildings.
Oh yeah. Are you with the jurisdiction?
Yes, I'm with the Castro Valley Sanitary District.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Yes, I think I would. I think reaching out to those businesses, letting them know what signage you have available, I think would be a tremendous resource to them. It also will ensure, some consistency and really help fit well with the other education that the district is doing.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And while we're waiting for any other question, just to add on to that point, so the a jurisdiction would not be required to go into a commercial business to see if they have the appropriate containers, appropriate signage, what they're doing for employees. So you're not required to, except edible food is different, but with organic waste recycling, you're not required to go in and check. You can, and certainly jurisdictions do when they're providing technical assistance. So just wanted to add that clarification.
Okay, our next question is from Mike. Mike, if you would like to unmute, state your affiliation and ask your question, please.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't heard the de minimis level. If you're 2 cubic yards of generation per week or more, it's 20 gallons. So I just wanted to confirm that.
Yeah, so I can restate that. So yes, de minimis amounts of waste are less than 20 gallons per week per applicable container for a business that's generating 2 cubic yards or more of total solid waste per week. And then the other part of that threshold is a de minimis amount of waste is also less than 10 gallons per week per applicable container for businesses that are generating less than 2 cubic yards of total solid waste per week.
Great, thank you so much. Sorry, and I'm from City of Galt.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Yeah, and just we've had a few questions on this. So if you have a 3-container system, then if a green container is less than 20 gallons or the blue container is less than 20 gallons, for example, the jurisdiction can issue a de minimis waiver to that commercial generator. So the 20 gallons is in reference to each of those containers, as Julia noted.
Great, thank you so much.
Our next question is from Laura. Laura, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your affiliation.
Thank you very much. With the City of Clayton. Kara, good to hear from you again and see you. You're still there. Yay.
Yay.
Yeah. I just want to get clarification on the enforcement component when you're talking about doing the waste contamination audit, so to speak. Are we allowed to include that in a contract provision with our hauler to do those? We don't have to do it as city staff. We just need to make sure, because I think that's how it's happening now. I just want to make sure. I didn't have any clarity when I read SB 1383 that we can include that and make that a hauler's responsibility to document and do all that stuff and then just file it with us or report on the annual report.
Yeah, correct. That is one of the many things that you can delegate to your hauler, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yes, there's still only me here, so there's not a lot of staff to do all this stuff. So
yeah, I know. Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, Laura, the only thing that I think you're going to want to work out, I'm not sure what you've thought of for how you're going to keep your records, but it would be important that you work it out so that your hauler is providing the records to the city. So if you're using some type of electronic system, whether it's the tool that CalRecycle is going to come out with or a commercial system, whatever that is, it's important that the city receives the records from the hauler in the event that a compliance evaluation is conducted, because it's the city that will have to provide CalRecycle with access to those records. So that would be one more thing you'd want to work out with a hauler.
Yeah, we should not have any problem. We use Republic Services, and they've got a pretty good database right now, and I know they've got some new electronic documentation processes that they're going to be using that we upload and send to the state with our annual report for backup. So
yeah, that's what I've been hearing, that Republic is developing something. And yeah, and then just to clarify, there are certain requirements that for information you'll submit in your annual report. And then there are other requirements that you just keep in your record implementation, and you will not be submitting that to CalRecycle. So you keep it on hand for a 5-year period in the event you are evaluated by CalRecycle.
Yeah, got it. Very similar to what we have now under the AB 939 plus.
Yeah, absolutely.
Records, and then provide them as needed to the state.
absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
Good to
thank
hear
you so
from
much.
you.
Good to see you.
You too. Take care.
Okay, our next question is from Derek. Derek, if you could please unmute and ask your question. Okay, Derek's question was, can you please define waste evaluation?
Yeah, so I can give that a quick crack. So first off, Derek, definitely you want to review section 18984.5C, as I think Ashley put that in the question pane. So this is the alternative to doing the route reviews. So this is a facility-based method. And so you're going to have samples from each container type and how many samples that you need. That's all outlined in the regulations. It's very specific. But the samples have to be taken from different areas in the jurisdiction, and they have to be taken to a sorting area at a permitted solid waste facility where the presence of those prohibited container contaminants for each container type is measured out to determine the ratio of prohibited contaminants in each container type by weight. So that's probably the simplest way I can say it without going into too much detail. Kara, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, let's just ask if that answered the question. Well, you can let us know if it didn't answer the question.
Our next question is from Rachel. Rachel, you are now unmuted. Please ask your question and state your affiliation.
Hello, Rachel Bosley, Stop Waste or Alameda County Waste Management Authority. One question I had was, do penalties have to be assessed on single-family homes starting in 2024 for lack of organics and recycling service? Specifically, Article 14, the enforcement section, seems to say that this only has to happen with commercial businesses, which do include multifamily, that generate 2 cubic yards or more. So it seems like single family that fall below that threshold would not have to be assessed penalties.
Yeah, good question. Make sure I'm unmuted here. Good question, Rachel. So the regulations, as you were referring to within Article 14 of the enforcement requirements, there is a requirement as part of a jurisdiction's inspection and enforcement program that each jurisdiction is going to implement starting Jan 1 of 2022. That beginning of April 1st of 2022, that the jurisdictions, they have two options. One of the options is going to be conducting annual route reviews of commercial businesses as well as residential generators for their compliance with the jurisdiction's organic collection program. So with that, and you also alluded to a second date, which is Jan 1 of 2024, which I believe was in your question, to which at that point would be the next trigger timeline to when the jurisdiction is to utilize the enforcement methods as part of that jurisdiction's program, which would then in turn would include the notices of violations and including any penalties assessed upon any of those per any violations that jurisdiction finds.
And
I don't feel like that.
I'll add in, Rachel. So
sure.
If you found a situation where a resident, single family resident, for example, was not subscribing to service, starting in 2024, you do have the ability to enforce on that. However, the way we describe it is because the way the regulations are constructed with providing mandatory or automatic service to generators, we really expect there to be little in the way of a need for enforcement, both on commercial businesses and residents. So, but the regulations do provide you that authority if you have that situation. And as Alan said, when it comes to the desk audits, you are still doing that desk audit that you do now for 1826 on those commercial businesses. But if maybe through the hauler or through, as Alan said, maybe doing the route reviews or something like that, you had a situation where a resident was not subscribing, you would have that ability. We don't anticipate that ever to be used or needed, but it is provided for, as Alan noted. Does that help, Rachel?
But a little bit, but ability to enforce is different than we are required to assess a penalty for that lack of service on single family. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. So this is kind of a gray area here. So from a department standpoint, looking upon jurisdictions, we're going to be performing compliance evaluation. Through the compliance evaluation, we're going to be evaluating how well and to what degree is that particular jurisdiction implementing their 1383 program. Now, whether or not that jurisdiction is utilizing their discretion, should they want to, and again, I think you're using the term have, and I'm not going to say that you have to do anything in regards to penalizing a single family household, but as from the department and from the compliance standpoint, evaluating jurisdictions as to how they're implementing their program, if they're not penalizing or enforcing their residential sector to ensure that their residentials and the single family homes within the jurisdiction are participating or properly participating within the jurisdiction's program and not doing anything about it, that could be deemed as terms as a violation finding from the department to that specific jurisdiction. So again, as Kara, was stating, there's measures that the jurisdiction is going to be including, having the ordinance and the requirements as set forth, and having their enforcement and inspection program as I was referring to as the requirement of all jurisdictions. It's going to be really at the jurisdiction's discretion on how they're going to be penalizing, and implementing that. From the biggest standpoint, from the department standpoint, we just want to ensure that the jurisdictions are implementing their 1383 program, and the compliance evaluation, and upon that, when we're doing those evaluations of jurisdictions, we're going to be assessing that, one aspect and portion is how are they implementing their enforcement and inspection program to each jurisdiction. And again, each jurisdiction is going to be a case-by-case basis on how things are evaluated per, different nuances and whatnot. But does that help answer your question? I can't really give you full direction on what you have to do, but the regulations do state the process of how jurisdictions are to develop their enforcement and inspection program.
Yeah, I think what you're alluding to is that in the enforcement section, the department, CalRecycle, can, there is a lot of lack of specificity in what constitutes a major, moderate, or minor violation by the jurisdiction. And I think you're saying that you may determine that this is considered a violation by the jurisdiction if they don't choose. I don't expect there's going to be a lot of single family homes that refuse organic service, but there's going to be some. And we also have the political nature of actually finding single family homes that is difficult for a lot of jurisdictions. So that's what I'm just trying to get at. And it sounds like you maybe don't have the specificity on whether that would be a violation to the jurisdictions if they did not penalize a single family home.
Yeah, and really from, from the department standpoint, and we're evaluating a particular jurisdiction, and jurisdictions, I can't really answer for all jurisdictions because there could be one jurisdiction and it's entirely all residential in the jurisdiction, and there's 10% of commercial businesses. But really what we're looking for from the department standpoint is, does the jurisdiction have an inspection and enforcement program? Do they have something in place? And are they implementing their inspection and enforcement program as required by what the regulations state and the process of how it lays out? I don't, it's hard for me to answer that specifically to any specific nuances and alluding to anything of how the department's going to enforce. And during this time, the department is still developing their enforcement process and procedures moving forward as we're walking to 2022 and finalizing a lot of those things. But I guess the best answer that I can give you is to recommend and ensure that jurisdictions beginning Jan 1 of 2022 have an inspection and enforcement program in place and have that laid out so that should the jurisdiction fall into a compliance evaluation, that the jurisdiction is prepared to provide that information through the implementation record and record keeping requirements, or just through any other process that the department puts forth with their compliance evaluation in that process. Does that help, Rachel? I feel like I've kind of dissected it a little bit, but it's hard for me without knowing the full ramifications of any specific situation regarding the jurisdiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think I get what you're saying, so it helps. Thank you.
And feel free to follow up, you know, if you have if anything does come up, or if you want to talk a little bit more offline. It makes perfect sense. And again, each jurisdiction is going to be case by case. Every jurisdiction has different nuances of residential, commercial. You know, there's a lot of moving pieces within every situation that comes through us in these Q&As, but we're available to talk offline should you want to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, our next couple questions are from David. David, if you wanted to state your affiliation and ask your questions. First one regarding the waivers.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can't hear me? Okay. The question on the waiver. On what date will CalRecycle start accepting the county applications for low population waivers, and there are others, for certain census tracts? Will CalRecycle provide an application form for this? Will counties be able to submit the applications in electronic format?
Thanks for the question, David. So we are providing an application form for all department issued with low population. They're actually on my plate right now to review them, so I will get on that. But the plan is that we're going to release them sometime in the summer, if not maybe earlier, depending on how fast our review is. And then the plan also is to do a webinar on them, so we could answer any questions that you guys have on it. Like a lot of our tools, we'll release it and then we'll schedule a webinar about a month later, just so you guys can come prepared with questions. The plan right now is that you guys could start submitting them in the fall sometime, and we'll give you kind of an exact date once we nail it down. But the reason for that is we wanted to provide you guys some certainty on Jan 1, 2022 if your waivers were approved. So even though you guys know 1383 actually is not, the regulations don't go into effect until Jan 1, 2022, we did want to provide you guys with some certainty. So we are hoping to start accepting in fall, to give you that certainty on Jan 1, 2022 if it's been approved. And in regards to your electronic submission, I'm hoping I'm hearing this right. If not, please correct me. But these waiver forms will be like a type of PDF that you'll just fill out, and then you could electronically submit it to us. We don't have the inbox yet that you would submit it to, but once we have that, we will let you know. But you also, in the regulations, it doesn't say you have to submit it electronically either. You can do hard copy as well. So I hope that helps, David. If not, please let me know.
No, that's great.
Okay, perfect.
And then Ashley, I'd just add that our intention is to actually provide jurisdictions with a list of all of the census tracts that meet the low population threshold, as well as the cities that meet the low population threshold, as well as the jurisdictions that meet the elevation threshold. And we already have a list of the jurisdictions that are eligible for the rural exemption. But we'll be providing all of that information, as well as information on how you can also use the US Census data to do the same thing that we will be doing. So we hope to have all that guidance in addition to the tools that Ashley already mentioned.
And then
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to add on to Kara, you know, as we're waiting for census information, it may not be available until fall. We're not sure yet. As you know, we're not the one who generates that. So that may be one thing that we may not be able to provide to you right away, but we will once it's available, just so you guys know we'll be using to base our decisions off of.
Very good. It's a little awkward because in the facility capacity assessment work, we'd have to assume whether or not we actually have the waiver or not. So it's a little awkward there.
David, can you add a little bit more info on that point? Because the CalRecycle, if you meet the threshold, you will be approved. There isn't discretion on CalRecycle's part. So for example, for unincorporated county for low population, if you meet the 75 people per square mile or less, that census tract will be approved. Does that help?
That helps a lot. There is some language in the regs that left that in question. And that's apparently there's going to be language to the waiver itself that specifies what's waived and what's not and to what degree it's waived. That's my understanding reading the regs anyway, so I was curious about that.
Do you mean like regarding what requirements in the regulations might be waived for that area? Is that what you're referencing?
Yeah, well, I don't know what the waiver will look like or what it will say, but it sounded like, you know, you need to pay attention to the detail of what's waived and what's not. If it's simply a yes or no, that's great.
Yeah.
That gives us something to rely on.
It is a yes, or it is going to be a yes or no from CalRecycle. If you meet the threshold, you'll be approved. But if you want to do any follow-up, please follow up with your LAM liaison. We can do a follow-up conversation and get into more of the details.
And I think just something to add on, yeah, in the waivers, I think I get what you're saying, David, is you may be exempt or waived from part or all of the regs. So maybe that's what you're talking about too, but I'm guessing that a lot of people who are going to apply for it will just apply for all of it in Article 3, not just some, but you may just want to do some and identify that. And then in the census tract, as Kara was saying, yes, if it's 75 people or less, like within a census this year or last year, whenever, it's most likely going to be approved. It's basically if you prove, or if you give us a census from like the 90s, then maybe we would question that. But besides that, you know, our department issued waivers are pretty straightforward. And as long as you submit the applicable information that's needed, it'll most likely get approved.
Good to hear. I had one more question I'd like to fit in if we have time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. What are our county's obligations in a circumstance where its collaborative effort to assess adequate facility capacity leads to lack of consensus on findings amongst the jurisdictions within the county? When disagreement exists, is the county obliged to act as final arbiter of whether one or more jurisdictions in the county lacks sufficient capacity? And is the county then responsible for notifying that or those agreeing jurisdictions or disagreeing jurisdictions of its decisions?
That is a great question. Thank you for asking. So each of the jurisdictions is ultimately responsible for conducting the capacity analysis and determining whether or not they have verified existing, new, or expanded capacity, whether that's organic waste or edible food. And they are to report that data to the county. So, you know, you are not necessarily, you're not doing any quality control of that data. I mean, you're just accepting that data from the jurisdiction. Certainly, if you have a question, once you start getting that data, we can always do a follow-up. But does that help clarify?
Well, there is a notification requirement. It's almost as if the county would have to make a decision there because we're responsible for notifying them whether they're lacking capacity.
I know, it is kind of funny the way that's worded. So a jurisdiction is going to know that they don't have capacity because they're doing the calculation, right? The notification was intended and is intended to give them a clock, to let them know that their clock has started. So it's letting them know the county is submitting our report on August 1, 2022, and then they have 120 days. So that's what that noticing is really intended for.
Okay, that does start the clock. Sounds good.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so our last question, which will wrap us up, is going to come from Doug. Doug, I am unmuting you right now. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is just kind of random. It's like, so a number of jurisdictions have litter and recycling containers that they provide in their downtown areas to prevent litter. Well, are they now going to be required to put an organics container in that area if I provide a 3-container system? And who's going to be responsible for enforcing the contamination at some point, because they're all contaminated?
Sure. Hey, thank you so much for that question. So that is not a requirement in the regulations for having public organics and recycling containers next to the litter containers. So a situation like in a park or a common outside area like you're describing, a jurisdiction would not have to do that.
Okay.
Does that help clarify?
That does.
Perfect. Well, it's almost 4 o'clock, so we are going to wrap this up. For any questions that we didn't answer for any of our topics, we will get back to you. We may reach out for a phone call, but we will get back to you in a timely manner. I know questions come up quite a bit about the recording of this. This will be posted online once we get it ADA compliant, as well as the PowerPoint with the talking points. So that will be available online once we could get it up. Please make sure you sign up for SLCP listserv, as we'll notify you then. As we mentioned throughout this whole webinar, there will be a number of tools and guidance that we will be releasing in the near future. So again, sign up for the SLCP listserv, and that's how we'll notify you. So thank you guys again for participating, and have a great rest of your day and a great weekend if we don't talk to you sooner. So thank you all.